What if a starving baron could become the most dangerous mage knight in a single day? And what if his greatest weapon was not a sword, but the loyalty of an entire territory? 𝗥𝗘𝗕𝗢𝗥𝗡 did not open his eyes inside his old rental apartment. He woke inside a ruined noble room, surrounded by yellow parchment and a world he did not understand. Then the memories struck him like a hammer. He was no longer an ordinary man from the modern world. He had become 𝗥𝗘𝗕𝗢𝗥𝗡, a 16-year-old baron in the magic continent. His title sounded impressive, but his reality was miserable. His castle was poor, his people were starving, and his enemies treated him like prey. Even worse, the original Chris had never awakened battle aura. In a world ruled by knights, mages, dragons, and nobles, that meant he was seen as useless. But the moment Chris accepted this broken life, a strange system awakened in his mind. It did not hand him a throne. It gave him a problem. The peanut fields of 𝗥𝗘𝗕𝗢𝗥𝗡 were dying, and if he failed, the people would starve even harder. Most nobles would blame the peasants and swing the whip. Chris did something no one expected. He walked into the fields himself. He looked at the yellow leaves, listened to the old farmer, and realized the truth. This was not laziness. This world simply did not understand fertilizer. Chris woke up and found himself in a small, run-down room, not his old rental apartment. There was a wooden table with tea sets and strange writing on yellowed parchment. Then a flood of memories hit him hard, and his head felt like it was splitting open. When the pain faded, Chris understood everything. Chris had transmigrated into a world called the Magic Continent, into the body of a 16-year-old baron named 𝗥𝗘𝗕𝗢𝗥𝗡. He had come to his territory, 𝗥𝗘𝗕𝗢𝗥𝗡, after his coming-of-age ceremony 6 months ago. A system had activated in his head. It gave him a task. The peanut fields in his territory were in trouble, and if Chris did not fix it soon, the harvest would drop. The reward was battle or awakening, something Chris desperately needed. In this world, talented kids awaken battle aura by age 12 or 15 and become knights. Chris was already 16 and a half with no awakening, so he was considered hopeless. But now, with the system, Chris had a chance. His administrator, Randall, came in to report on his work. He mentioned the peanut fields were turning yellow and blamed the serfs for being lazy. He had already punished them. Chris told him not to jump to conclusions and decided to go see for himself. Chris left the castle with Randall and his chief knight, Jonathan, a muscular, red-haired man at the 3rd knight rank, along with 4 other first-rank knights. Chris rode the only horse in the whole town while they walked beside him. Along the way, Chris saw thin, hungry-looking serfs heading to the fields. They all dropped to their knees when they saw him. To them, Chris was their absolute ruler. They reached the terrace peanut fields, about 13 or 14 acres, and more than half the plants had turned yellow. An old serf named Old John ran out from a shabby straw hut nearby. He was skinny, dressed in rags, and covered in whip marks. He knelt before him, trembling with fear. Randall kicked him and called him a lazy fool, but Old John swore he watered the fields every week without fail. Chris stopped Randall, got off his horse, and picked a yellowed peanut leaf to examine it. Randall fussed that a nobleman shouldn't do such things with his own hands, but Chris ignored him. Coming from the modern world, Chris did not care about those rules. Chris was pretty sure the peanuts were lacking nitrogen fertilizer. So, Chris asked Old John, when he last fertilized the soil. He looked confused and had no idea what fertilizer even was. Neither did Randall or anyone else. Chris rubbed his forehead and asked him how he normally took care of the peanuts. Old John told him he weeded and picked bugs 3 times a day without fail. So, the problem wasn't laziness. This world just didn't have the concept of fertilizer. Crops grew, however, they grew, and people left it up to fate. Chris ordered Randall to have all the serfs to stop their regular work. Chris told them to dig mud from the pond and mix it with wood ash from their cooking fires, then bury the mixture into the peanut fields. Randall and the knights spread the word across 𝗥𝗘𝗕𝗢𝗥𝗡. Soon about 140 workers were digging pond mud while the rest gathered dry wood to burn into ash. By the end of the morning, all 13+ acres of peanut fields had been fertilized. When the work was done, Chris told Randall to pay each serf 20 copper coins. He couldn't believe it. In his mind, serfs working for their lord was just how things were supposed to be. But Chris shut him down. Where Chris came from, people should be paid for their labor. Besides, his serfs were skin and bones. How could Chris expect them to work hard if they were starving? When the serfs heard about the payment, they were overjoyed and praised him with all their hearts. Right then, the system chimed in his head. Task complete. The reward was battle or awakening. A warm current flowed through his body, and when Chris held out his hand, a silver-white swirl of energy appeared on his palm. Chris was now a trainee knight. With some practice, Chris could become a real first-rank knight. Jonathan noticed immediately as a third-rank knight. He could sense battle aura. He was shocked and thrilled. A lord with battle aura meant real potential, the chance to earn military achievements, raise their noble rank, and expand their territory. For everyone under him, it meant hope for a better future. They headed back to the castle. His maid, Ruth Sandy, greeted him with lunch, a steak served with silver cutlery. Even a poor countryside noble still ate with silver. Chris wasn't used to steak, but there wasn't much choice. After eating, Chris went to take a nap, deciding to accept this new life since there was no going back. Chris was woken by urgent knocking. Ruth told him that Jonathan had reported Baron Anthony Hughes was causing trouble on his land again. Anthony was his neighbor. The two territories had been clashing for a while. He was a first-rank knight, and the old Chris had been just an ordinary person. So Anthony always had the upper hand. But things were different now. Chris clenched his fist, headed outside, mounted his horse, and told Jonathan to lead the way as fast as he could. On the way there, Jonathan filled him in on what happened. Between his territory and Baron Anthony's, there are a few popular trees marking the border. One of his serfs had been relieving himself under a tree, and Anthony caught him. Anthony claimed the serf had crossed into his land and wanted to execute him. The thing is, only a lord has the right to punish his own serfs. Another noble killing someone else's serf is considered a direct insult. So, this wasn't really about a serf crossing a line. Anthony was using it as an excuse to humiliate him. When Chris arrived at the eastern edge of his territory, a crowd had gathered. Anthony was there, a guy in his 20s, with brown hair and gray-brown eyes, wearing fancy clothes. One of his serfs was hanging from a tree beside him, covered in whip marks and barely groaning. Chris got off his horse and demanded to know what he was doing. He laughed and said his serf had trespassed, so he had the right to kill him. The serf weakly protested, and Anthony slapped him across the face, claiming 1 foot had crossed the border. This guy was clearly here just to pick a fight. The old Chris would have swallowed this insult, but Chris is not that person. Back in his previous life, Chris was known for being a fierce fighter in school. Chris never backed down from anyone, win or lose. Chris shouted at Anthony to release the serf immediately. He was stunned. So was Jonathan. The old Chris had never stood up like this before. Anthony tossed some silver coins at his feet and said he was buying the serf's life. Chris refused and roared at him again to let the man go. When he mocked him, Chris ordered Jonathan and the knights to draw their swords. Both sides were evenly matched. Each had 1 third-rank knight and 4 first-rank knights. But Anthony himself was a first-rank knight, which gave his side the edge. Chris did not care. Chris charged straight at Anthony. Jonathan eagerly took on the enemy's third-rank knight. He'd been holding back his frustration for half a year. Anthony released his battle aura and met his charge. Their fists collided, and Chris was knocked back 4 or 5 steps, while Anthony only moved 2 or 3. Anthony mocked him, saying a trainee knight was nothing to him, and grabbed a tree branch as a weapon. So, Chris fought dirty. Chris sprinted at him, kicked sand into his eyes, and tackled him to the ground. Chris scratched him with his nails, bit him with his teeth. His face and body were soon covered in wounds. When he punched him, Chris bit down on his ear until blood ran between his teeth, then clawed 5 bloody streaks across his face. Everyone froze. The watching serfs, even the fighting knights on both sides, stopped to stare at his wild fighting style. Anthony screamed for help. His knight suggested to Jonathan that they pull them apart before both lords got seriously hurt. Jonathan agreed. They separated them. Anthony's face was torn up, his ear was bleeding, and his clothes were a mess. Anthony pointed at him, shaking with rage, and called him a madman, unfit to be a noble. Chris's own face was bruised, black and blue, but Chris spat out the blood in his mouth and told him that he didn't get to decide who deserved to be a noble. Chris warned him that next time would be worse. Anthony was so angry he said "you" 3 times, and then fainted on the spot. Chris told his knights to take him and get out, and that if he ever came to his territory looking for trouble again, he'd regret it even more. His knights carried him away without a word. Chris ordered his people to cut down the poor serf hanging from the tree. No matter what, he was just an innocent man caught up in a conflict between 2 lords. Jonathan cut the serf down from the tree right away. The man dropped to his knees and thanked him. His name was Dean. Chris told him to take the silver coins Anthony had thrown on the ground as compensation and to use them to recover because Chris still needed him to work. After Chris rode off, the watching serfs praised him. Having a lord who would stand up for them gave them hope. Back at the castle, Ruth gasped when she saw his bruised face. Chris told her not to worry. The other guy looked way worse. Anthony probably wouldn't wake up for a while, and it would take him at least 10 days to 2 weeks to recover. Ruth cleaned his wounds with medicinal wine while Chris sat back and thought things over. His dirty fighting had worked this time, but the gap in real strength was still there. Once Anthony healed, he might come for revenge. Chris needed to reach first-rank knight as soon as possible. Then the system chimed again with a new task. An unexpected guest had arrived in his territory, and Chris should treat them well for a surprising reward. The details were vague. It didn't say whether the guest was a person or some kind of creature. Chris called Jonathan over and told him to take to knights and patrol the territory, reporting anything unusual immediately. By evening, there was still no word. After dinner, Chris went to his study and tried to brainstorm business ideas using knowledge from his previous life. Chris needed money badly. Chris was a broke lord with nothing, but everything Chris thought of either required materials Chris did not have, or knowledge Chris lacked. Chris stayed up late without coming up with anything useful. When Chris was about to head to bed, Chris suddenly noticed a figure in a gray robe standing at his door. It startled him, and Chris stumbled backward, knocking over a chair. The outfit was clearly that of a mage. She pulled down her hood and introduced herself as Tina, a mage. She was around 18 or 19, with snow-white skin, wavy brownish gold hair, big eyes, and long eyelashes. She sat down casually and told him she had been injured and needed a place to recover for about 3 months. She was asking to stay in his castle. Chris understood. She wanted free room and board. Most mages lived on their own, since nobles didn't like them much due to their unusual research. It was rare for one to come asking a noble for help. Chris told her nothing was free and asked what Chris would get in return. She leaned in close and said she could sense magic power inside him. She offered to teach him magic, which would make him a magic warrior, someone who uses both battle aura and magic. Magic warriors are the strongest, at the same rank, but training in both means you probably won't reach the highest levels. Chris turned her down. Becoming a magic warrior didn't interest him. Then she tossed a ring onto the table, a silver ring with a tiny yellow gem. It was a spatial ring, a magic item with 100 cubic units of storage space inside. Opened and closed with a bit of battle aura. Chris put it on and tested it. 10 compartments appeared in his mind. It was genuinely useful and would make things a lot more convenient. Chris accepted the deal and put the ring on. Then Chris asked her why she had chosen to come to him specifically. Tina told him why she chose him. She had arrived in his territory that same day and watched everything. How Chris did not punish old John, but instead solved the peanut field problem. How Chris fought Anthony to protect his serf. And how Chris gave Dean the silver coins. She said, out of the hundreds of nobles she'd met, Chris was the only one who treated serfs like actual people. Chris realized that if Chris had arrived, even 1 day later, the original Chris would have driven her away because he was just like every other noble. Then something alarming happened. Tina suddenly grabbed his teacup and sniffed it. She told him it had been poisoned with a magical toxin. Green scale snake venom mixed with blue-eyed lizard saliva. Colorless, odorless, and instantly lethal. That must be how the original Chris died, which gave him the chance to take over his body. Chris searched through all of Chris's memories, but couldn't figure out who did it. Anthony seemed like the obvious suspect, but it didn't make sense. He actually benefited from having a weak neighbor to bully. Tina said the poison was simple enough for a first-rank mage, but sneaking it into his cup unnoticed would require at least a third-rank mage. That meant someone powerful was hiding in the shadows, watching him. It was a chilling thought. Chris asked Tina her rank, but she just smiled and said it was a secret. Chris set her up in the empty room next to his. Having a mage sleeping right beside him was good protection in case the hidden enemy came back. It was a win-win arrangement. That night, lying in bed, Chris quietly circulated the battle aura inside his body. After several cycles, Chris heard a cracking sound deep within him, and his aura surged dramatically. Chris had broken through to first-rank knight in just 1 day since awakening. That was unheard of on this continent. His skin turned red and hot, and Chris could feel his body getting much stronger, maybe 3 times what it was before. Then he felt something cool flowing through him, calming the heat. It wasn't battle ore, it was magic power, the same energy Tina had mentioned. Chris held out both hands. Silver white aura swirled in his right palm, and clear water-like magic energy floated in his left. The battle aura breakthrough had triggered his magic to awaken too. Chris was now a first-rank magic warrior, both knight and mage. The system upgraded itself to version 2.0 and unlocked a reputation feature. Chris could earn reputation points by expanding territory, defeating enemies, and earning his people's love. With enough reputation, Chris could level up directly. This changed everything. Normally, a magic warrior's progress is slow because you're splitting your training between two disciplines, but with the system, Chris could bypass that limitation entirely. Someday, Chris might even become the first 9th-rank magic warrior in history. Chris fell asleep dreaming about that. The next morning, Ruth helped him get ready, and Chris sat down for breakfast. Milk and white bread with silver cutlery. The bread was dry and hard like stale steamed buns. The milk was straight from the cow, greasy and fishy tasting. Nothing like the processed milk from his old world. Both were considered luxuries here, but for someone from the 21st century, they were barely edible. Then Chris remembered in his previous life. Chris was a pastry chef who ran a dessert shop. Chris could make cream and put it in the bread to make it taste much better. Before Chris could start on that idea, Chris heard a commotion outside. Chris was interrupted by his butler, Robert, dragging in a maid named 𝗥𝗘𝗕𝗢𝗥𝗡. Her hair was messy. Her face had a red slap mark, and she was kneeling on the ground in tears. Robert told him she had stolen 30 silver coins. Chris lifted her chin and asked why. She said it was to pay for her sick brother's treatment. Chris remembered from the old Chris's memories that she had once asked for an advance on her salary. For this exact reason, and the previous Chris had refused her. Robert said that by noble law, Chris should hang her as an example. But Chris could not do that over some stolen money. She was a hard worker who never complained about the toughest chores. Killing her would be a loss for him too. So, Chris told her to keep the money for her brother's treatment, but it would be deducted from her future pay. She'd also get 20 lashes as punishment for the theft. She thanked him over and over. Then, golden text appeared before his eyes. Reputation from 𝗥𝗘𝗕𝗢𝗥 +5. So, that's how the reputation system worked. Chris tested it further by raising Robert's monthly salary from 8 to 10 silver coins and got 2 more points from him. But Robert reminded him of a problem. After lending 𝗥𝗘𝗕𝗢𝗥 the money, Chris only had enough funds and food to last 1 month. The crops wouldn't be ready for 3 months. Chris was broke. Other transmigrators end up as wealthy young masters. And here Chris was, a poor baron whose only income came from grain taxes that barely covered daily expenses. Chris racked his brain trying to think of a business idea, but nothing came to him. In his previous life, Chris was just a pastry chef running a dessert shop, not some business genius. Chris decided to deal with the most urgent thing first, making his food edible. Chris called the cook, Mrs. Ellen, and asked her for 5 eggs, a small bowl of sugar, and a cup of milk. Making basic cream was something Chris could do in his sleep. Chris separated the egg whites into a bowl, stirred them with a fork until they foamed, then added milk and a spoonful of sugar, and kept stirring. After a few rounds, the liquid thickened into a pale yellow cream. Chris tasted it, sweet, rich, and full of milky flavor. Chris spread a big scoop on bread, sandwiched it, and took a bite. It was delicious. Chris ate until Chris was full, and still had half a bowl left. Then an idea hit him. What if sharing this cream with his servants earned him reputation points? Chris had everyone in the castle come over. 5 servants lined up. Ruth was the first to try it. Her eyes lit up, and she said it was amazing. 2 reputation points from Ruth. Then the others rushed in to taste it, fighting over the bowl. Each one gave him 2 points. In total, Chris earned 10 reputation points just from that one bowl of cream. Chris checked his status. 17 reputation points out of 2,000 needed to reach 2nd rank magic warrior. At this rate, it might take less than a month to level up. One of the maids then asked him what this delicious stuff was called. Chris told them it was called cream. Ruth licked her lips and said it was the most delicious thing she'd ever eaten. She bet even city nobles had never tasted anything like it. That comment gave him an idea. Chris could sell cream to wealthy nobles. They'd never seen anything like it in this world, so they'd love it. Chris could solve his money problem, earn reputation points, and grow stronger all at once. Chris rushed to his bedroom and pulled out a small locked wooden chest from under the bed. Inside was his entire fortune, 30 silver coins. Chris packed them all into a small cloth bag and headed out, telling Mrs. Ellen not to make him lunch. Chris ordered Jonathan to leave one night to guard the castle and bring the other 3 with him to 𝗥𝗘𝗕𝗢𝗥𝗡, the nearest town where many nobles lived. It was only a few dozen miles away, and with the knights running alongside his horse, they got there in about 2 hours. 𝗥𝗘𝗕𝗢𝗥𝗡 had tall walls dozens of meters high and busy streets full of vendors. The old Chris had lived here for 15 years before getting his baron title, so Chris knew the place well from his memories. Chris rented a shop in a decent location for 5 silver coins, then gave each knight 3 silver coins to go buy supplies: milk, eggs, sugar, wooden basins, spoons, and paper bowls. They came back with everything: 20 pounds of eggs, 4 big cups of milk, 2 pounds of sugar, and all the tools. Chris put the knights to work cracking eggs, separating the whites, and stirring them in the basins. Even Jonathan got a basin and spoon. Their stamina was impressive. The egg whites foamed up in minutes. Chris had them add milk and sugar in stages and keep stirring. About 15 minutes later, the mixture turned into smooth white cream. The quality was even better than what Chris had made at the castle because the milk was higher grade. Chris calculated the costs. 15 silver coins total for about 80 servings. So, roughly 19 copper coins per serving. Selling at 50 copper coins each seemed fair. Chris had the knights scoop the cream into paper bowls and set up a table outside the shop. Jonathan asked what they were selling. Chris told him to call it snow cake. Cream sounded too plain, and snow cake had a nicer ring to it, white like snowflakes. Chris waited eagerly, but nobody stopped to ask about it. Chris figured they needed to advertise, so Chris told Jonathan to shout and attract customers. He was embarrassed, but Chris told him if they didn't sell anything, Chris would go bankrupt and he wouldn't get paid next month. So there he was, a huge, muscular man, nearly 2 meters tall, awkwardly calling out in a shy voice, "Essence snow cake, sweet, sweet snow cake." It looked so ridiculous that people couldn't help but notice. Sure enough, a young man stopped at their stall and asked, "How much?" Chris told him 50 copper coins per bowl. The young man said 50 copper coins was too expensive, and walked away. Chris could not believe it. If he just tasted it, he'd know it was worth every coin. Chris thought about offering free samples like stores did in his old world. But cream isn't something you can stick on a toothpick. So, Chris started dropping the price. 40 copper coins, nobody came. 30, still nothing. 20, not a single buyer. Jonathan happily ate a whole bowl and licked the paper clean, then asked him why nobody was buying something so delicious. Chris had no answer. The cream was starting to melt, so Chris gave each knight a bowl to avoid wasting it. Finally, Chris dropped the price to 10 copper coins. Even though that meant selling at a loss, Chris just wanted to recover some of his money. His very first business venture in this world was turning into a complete disaster. Then a man stopped by their stall. He turned out to be Baron Raymond, a local nobleman who worked as a city official. He bought one bowl for 10 copper coins. Chris and his knights were so excited over that single sale that the poor man looked confused. What Chris did not know at the time was that Raymond had a 10-year-old daughter named Sherry, who had stopped eating for the past 2 years. She was dangerously thin, skin and bones. No doctor or even a mage could figure out what was wrong. Raymond had actually bought the snow cake on a whim. It reminded him of how his daughter used to beg him for sweets when she was little. He left the snow cake on the dining table and went to his study. While nobody was in the room, Sherry wandered in and noticed the white stuff. She loved snow and thought it looked like it. She grabbed a handful and ate it. Her eyes lit up. She ate a second bite, then a third, and finished the entire bowl. When Raymond came back and saw the empty bowl, he could barely believe it. He found his daughter by the sink, washing her sticky hands. She had cream on her lips. She looked up at him and said, "Daddy, it's yummy." She wanted more. Raymond burst into tears. His daughter was finally eating again. He grabbed a fistful of silver coins from his bedroom, gathered every servant in the house, over 20 people, and marched out the door to find his stall. Just when Chris had almost given up, the system notified him. 10 reputation points from Sherry, 10 from Raymond. Chris jumped up and told the knights to get ready. Business was coming. A huge crowd appeared, over 100 people, led by Raymond, with more than 20 servants behind him, plus a mob of curious onlookers who'd followed along. Raymond marched up and said he'd buy every bowl Chris had, but Chris told him the price was now 2 silver coins per bowl, not 10 copper. He got angry and accused him of price gouging. Chris explained that 10 copper was a first customer trial price, and with his secret family recipe, the real cost was already 1 silver coin. 2 silver was actually a fair deal. He agreed, but then Chris added another rule. 1 bowl per person, no bulk buying. He thought Chris was crazy for turning away money. Chris told him the snow cake melts within a day and he'd just be wasting it. The real reason, of course, was that if he bought everything, nobody else could taste it and give him reputation points. Raymond settled for 5 bowls, paid 10 silver coins, and asked him to reserve one for his daughter tomorrow. After he left, the crowd went wild. People started asking whether the snow cake was really that good, especially since Raymond's daughter, who supposedly refused to eat anything, apparently loved it. They rushed the stall. The snow cake sold out in less than 30 minutes. 75 bowls at 2 silver coins each, 150 silver coins total. His cost had been only 15 silver coins, 10 times the profit. Better yet, Chris earned 75 reputation points from those customers. Those strangers only gave him 1 point each instead of 2 like his servants. Combined with what Chris already had, Chris passed the 100-point mark. Chris could feel his body heat up as his battle aura surged and grew denser. Chris checked his system panel. 112 reputation out of 2,000. The 3-day task to earn 100 reputation was already complete. The reward was an epic magic material called a dragon eye stone. Chris went inside the shop alone, made sure nobody could see, and claimed the reward. A fist-sized black vortex with purple lightning appeared in the air, and a walnut-sized stone dropped out. It was white with red lines running through it, and a black circle on one side. It really did look like an eyeball. Chris had no idea what it was for, so Chris stored it in his spatial ring to ask Tina about later. Chris gave each knight 2 silver coins as a bonus, which earned him 8 more reputation points. Jonathan handed him the money back, 150 silver coins, heavy and clinking. His first day in business had gone from total failure to a massive success. Chris handed out the bonus coins, locked up the shop, and they headed home. It was around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and they'd barely make it back before dark. Riding along on his horse, Chris started planning his next steps. First, personal strength was critical. This world had magical beasts and bandits everywhere. His battle aura was tied to the system's reputation, and Chris had noticed that his own people gave him 2 points each, while outsiders only gave 1. So keeping his people happy was key. Second, Chris needed new products. Cream was great, but people would get tired of something so sweet after a while. Chris decided to develop fruit jam next. Easy for a pastry chef like him. Then Chris had plant fruit trees on his land, creating a full production chain from growing to processing. That would mean jobs for his people, better income, better lives, and more reputation for him. 2 birds with 1 stone. While Chris was thinking, Chris pulled out the dragon eye stone and turned it over in his hands, wondering what it was for. Then Jonathan's voice cut through, sharp and serious. He warned Chris to be careful. Up ahead, on a small hill, stood a figure wrapped in a black robe, dark mist swirling around him. Jonathan said it was a dark mage. That was bad news. Regular mages were mostly harmless, just a bit eccentric, but dark mages were unpredictable killers. One had even wiped out an entire city in history. The dark mage let out a creepy laugh and said he'd been searching for something for years and had finally found it. He was staring right at the dragon eye stone in his hand. Then he looked at his face and froze. He recognized him as the Baron of Hopetown and couldn't understand how Chris was still alive after drinking the magical poison he'd prepared. So this was the one who killed the original Chris. Old grudge and new grudge all in one place. Jonathan drew his sword, and the knights surrounded him. But the dark mage Blake summoned 4 monsters from clouds of black smoke. A 2-headed purple snake, as thick as a man's waist and over 15 meters long. A creature with an eagle's head, lion's body, and black wings. A wolf-headed humanoid carrying a spiked club. And a massive boar covered in fish scales. All 4 had glowing red eyes. Jonathan took on the 2-headed snake and told the other 3 knights to handle the rest. Chris dismounted, ready to fight too. Chris was a first-rank magic warrior now. The battle erupted. Jonathan had a tough time with the snake. His sword just sparked off its hard scales, and its tail sent him flying. The other knights were barely holding their own against the remaining monsters. Then Blake made his move. A black whirlwind carried him straight toward him. Jonathan leaped up to intercept, but Blake pulled out a half-meter wand and conjured a black shield that stopped Jonathan's sword cold. Blake fired a dark magic ball at Jonathan, who barely dodged it, only to have the two-headed snake lunge at him from behind. Just when things looked desperate, a girl's voice rang out. Green vines as thick as arms shot out and wrapped around the two-headed snake, pinning its heads back. Chris looked over and saw a girl in a gray mage's robe standing a few dozen meters away. The girl was a mage, maybe 15 or 16, with a bit of baby fat on her face and a walnut one. She had a badge with 2 leaves on her chest. A second-rank mage, she was incredibly powerful. She scattered seeds on the ground, made them grow instantly into thick, thorny vines, and whipped the two-headed snake until it was full of bloody holes. But Blake pointed his wand at the snake and cast a spell called demonization. The snake's body swelled, its wound stopped bleeding, and it radiated dark purple mist. Its power surged so much that it could fight both Jonathan and the girl mage at the same time, and still have the upper hand. Then Blake turned his cold eyes on him. Chris could tell he was looking at him like Chris was already dead. He flew toward him on a black whirlwind, wand raised, and fired a bolt of black lightning. Chris dodged sideways just in time. It hit a boulder behind him and shattered it to pieces. As he closed in for another shot, Chris grabbed his wand and yanked it, then drove his knee into his gut. The wand flew out of his hands and he crashed to the ground several meters away. Chris snapped the wand over his knee. He pulled a backup wand from a ring, but Chris kicked it out of his hand before he could use it. Sent it flying over 100 meters away. A mage without a wand is like a snake without fangs. Chris unleashed everything he had. His battle aura blazed as he pounded Blake with one punch after another. In less than a minute, his face was a mess. Several ribs were broken and his whole body was falling apart. Jonathan, still fighting the snake, shouted and hurled his sword to him. Chris caught it mid-air, flipped it downward, and drove it straight through Blake's chest. Blood splattered hot on his face. His eyes went dull and stayed open. 20 reputation points. The moment Blake died, all 4 monsters screamed and melted into puddles. Chris dropped to the ground, heart pounding out of his chest. Then Chris noticed a ring on Blake's finger, silver with a milky white gem. Chris realized it was another spatial ring, the one he'd pulled his backup wand from. Chris took it off his hand. The young mage walked over and told him Chris was impressive. Chris thanked her for the help and introduced himself. Her name was Linda, a second-rank mage specializing in plant magic. She said hunting down dark mages was every mage's duty, since dark mages had ruined their profession's reputation throughout history. While chatting with Linda, Chris injected battle aura into Blake's spatial ring. 10 storage compartments appeared in his mind. When Chris saw what was stored inside, his expression changed. Inside Blake's spatial ring, 6 of the 10 compartments held transparent jars filled with greenish liquid, and floating inside were halves of animal bodies. A horse's torso, a hog's head, all kinds of parts. The horrifying thing was they were still moving. The remaining compartments had clothes, food, magic books, and magical materials. Chris nearly vomited and ran off to dump it all out. Linda explained that some dark mages practiced splicing magic, stitching 2 different animals together to create monsters. That's where those 4 creatures they fought had come from. After Chris calmed down, Linda dug through the pile and pulled out 4 gray crystal balls the size of walnuts. She called them soul crystals. They could capture a magical beast soul and bind it to you through a master-servant contract. You could then store the beast inside the crystal and release it whenever you needed. That's how Blake had summoned his monsters and why they died when he did. Chris kept 3 crystals and gave Linda the 4th as thanks for her help. Then Chris showed her the Dragon Eye Stone and asked what it was. Her eyes went wide. She said it was an extremely rare material needed to craft epic-level magic equipment. Chris told her Chris had found it. Chris wasn't about to mention the system. Then Chris had an idea. Since Linda specialized in plant magic, she could make crops grow faster. Chris offered her a deal. Work on his territory for 6 months, and Chris had give her the Dragon Eye Stone as payment. To him, a mage who could speed up plant growth was worth far more than any stone. She agreed immediately. They all walked back to Hope Town together. When Linda saw his land, she said the soil was fertile, and she liked it. She tapped her wand and made a few flowers bloom on the spot. Chris knew. Chris had made the right call bringing her back. At the castle, the knight on guard duty told him Anthony was at the border again, shouting for him. Chris could not believe that guy had recovered so quickly. Just one day, and he was already back for more. They headed over. Anthony was wrapped in bandages, especially around the ear Chris had bitten. He was furious and challenged him to a one-on-one duel. Chris accepted instantly, which seemed to surprise him. Then Chris released his silver-white battle aura and told him Chris was now a first-rank knight too. He and all his men were stunned. It had taken Anthony for years to go from trainee to first-rank knight. Chris had done it at 16, practically unheard of on the entire continent. Jonathan tossed him his sword. Chris pointed it at Anthony and told him to come on. He charged with his blade raised, eyes full of killing intent. Chris blocked his strike. Sparks flew as their swords clashed. The old Chris had received sword training as a child, and Chris had inherited those skills through his memories. So Chris wasn't helpless with a blade. Chris shoved his sword upward, making him stumble, and kicked him hard in the stomach. He staggered back with blood on his lips. They both released their full battle aura. There they stood in the last light of sunset, glowing like silver beacons, ready to settle this once and for all. Even though Chris had just become a first-rank knight, his battle aura was surprisingly on par with Anthony's. Chris attacked first, gripping his sword with both hands and extending his aura into a glowing blade over 2 meters long. Chris fought with big aggressive swings that pushed Anthony back, step by step, landing multiple hits. His clothes were torn and he was bleeding. Then Anthony's third-rank knight warned Jonathan not to celebrate too early. Anthony had not used a battle skill yet. That worried Chris because he had not had any chance to learn battle skills since his breakthrough. Anthony roared that Chris had forced his hand and unleashed a technique called Green Lotus Sword Art. His aura exploded outward like a blooming lotus tinged with green. Chris could feel how dangerous this attack was. If Chris could not counter it, Chris might die on the spot. In that life or death moment, something strange happened. Chris's mind became crystal clear, and all the martial arts movies and shows he had watched in his previous life replayed in his head. The techniques the characters used became vivid and real. His body moved on its own, leaving afterimages behind him. His aura formed into a dragon that coiled around him. Everyone was stunned. Anthony's bearded knight fell to the ground in shock, muttering that Chris had created his own battle skill, something that normally took families hundreds of years to develop. Chris pushed his left palm forward and shouted, "18 dragon subduing palms." A silver or a dragon roared toward Anthony. His green lotus shattered on contact, and the dragon crashed through 4 or 5 layers of magical, defensive items he was wearing. Necklaces, bracelets, all breaking apart into shields and barriers. Each one only held for a second before shattering. By the time the dragon hit Anthony, it was nearly transparent, but still powerful enough to send him flying, coughing blood. His sword knocked away before anyone recovered from their shock. Chris rushed forward, grabbed Anthony, and held his sword to his neck. He begged him to talk it out. His bearded knight reminded him that noble law forbade killing an innocent noble. Chris smiled coldly and said, Chris wouldn't kill him, but cutting off a certain part of his body below the belt shouldn't be a problem. Anthony clamped his legs together in terror. In this world, as long as you didn't kill another noble, even momming them was technically legal. And since Anthony was just a second son with no inheritance rights, his family probably wouldn't bother seeking revenge over something like that. The bearded knight quickly stepped in and asked how much money Chris wanted. Chris held up 3 fingers, 3 gold coins equal to 300 silver. Anthony called him a bandit. Chris raised it to 5 gold coins. He shut up after that. Chris gave them half an hour to bring the money, warning that every 10 minutes past the deadline would add 2 more gold coins. Anthony sent his bearded knight running to fetch his money chest from under his bed. Chris asked Linda to tie Anthony up so Chris wouldn't have to keep holding a sword to his neck. She pointed her wand and grew vines from the ground that wrapped him up like a bundle. Anthony was shocked to realize Chris had a mage on his side now. Chris sat down on a rock and waited. Chris had only asked Linda to show off a little. As a first-rank knight, holding a sword all day wouldn't actually tire him. The bearded knight came sprinting back with a black money chest in under 10 minutes. Anthony cursed him for handing it over without thinking, since the key was still in Anthony's pocket. Chris cut the vines and Anthony reluctantly opened the chest. Inside were 3 gold coins, some silver, and a bunch of copper, but it wasn't enough. After pulling out the 3 gold coins, he still needed 200 silver to make 5 gold total. He scraped together 195 silver coins, and the copper fell short too. He couldn't even afford his own ransom. Chris told him to forget the last 5 silver and swept everything into his spatial ring. Then something funny happened. The system showed him 5 reputation points from Anthony. Chris had captured the guy, taken nearly all his money, and he was grateful. Chris let the last bit slide. Chris felt like Chris had stumbled onto an exploit for farming reputation. Chris set him free. His money chest had maybe a couple hundred copper coins left. Chris almost felt bad. But then again, the old Chris had been squeezed dry by Anthony, the exact same way multiple times before. That's partly why Chris had been so poor. They headed home. By the time they reached the castle, it was fully dark. Robert and all the servants were waiting anxiously at the gate. Chris told them that starting next month, everyone's pay would go up by 2 silver coins. They cheered, and Chris collected 16 reputation points from the 8 of them. With the snow cake business bringing in money, a few extra silver coins meant nothing compared to the reputation Chris gained. When Robert tried to warn him about spending, Chris pulled out the heavy money bag and jingled it. He went quiet. To celebrate his promotion to first-rank knight, Chris told Mrs. Ellen to bring out all the meat in the kitchen. They were having a bonfire barbecue party. Everyone was stunned when they heard Chris had reached first rank. Just yesterday, Chris had only awakened his aura. Going from trainee to first-rank knight in a single day was something even legendary. Holy knights couldn't do. The congratulations poured in, along with 10 more reputation points. Chris had Ruth prepare a room for Linda, then sat in the castle's small courtyard, watching everyone bustle around preparing dinner. Mrs. Ellen lit a bonfire, and soon the smell of roasting meat filled the air. They gathered around a big stone table with all kinds of grilled food. Chris sat at the head with Jonathan, Robert, and the knights along the sides. Linda and Tina, his 2 mages, also met each other for the first time. It felt warm and lively like a real home. Chris liked this feeling a lot. Chris insisted that the servants sit at the table with them. Robert raised his mug of wheat ale and toasted his promotion. Everyone drank and celebrated. The maids' cheeks turned rosy from the alcohol, and people sang and danced around the bonfire. They ate maybe 50 pounds of meat, half of the castle's entire stock. After dinner, Linda went straight to bed since it was her first time drinking, and she was exhausted from the journey. Later that night, Tina and Chris went up to the top floor of the castle and looked out at the stars. From 4 stories up, Chris could see all of Hope Town, mostly darkness, with just a few tiny lights scattered around. Chris told Tina it was beautiful and peaceful. She agreed and said she liked it here because there were no stuffy, noble customs. But she also pointed out that while they enjoyed ourselves, the serfs out there were still going hungry and wearing rags. Chris told her firmly that Chris would change that and make this land better. She said she believed him, that Chris was different from other hypocritical nobles. Chris asked Tina to teach him magic. Originally, Chris had planned to skip magic and focus on battle aura, since training both would limit his progress. But now, with the system tying his advancement to reputation, that wasn't a problem anymore. Tina rolled her eyes and told him to reach first rank in magic. First, Chris snapped his fingers and released a wave of magic power. Chris was already a first-rank mage. She was stunned and backed away in disbelief. Yesterday, his magic had been barely detectable, and now Chris was first rank. She reminded him their original deal was just room and board for 3 months in exchange for the spatial ring. Chris offered to extend it to 6 months. She said her injuries would heal in 3, so what was the point? Chris sweetened the deal. The first 3 months would be free room and board, and for the next 3 months, Chris would cover all the materials for her magic experiments. Having a noble lord supply your research materials was much safer and more convenient than searching on your own. She thought it over and agreed. Then, a pitch-black pigeon with glowing orange eyes flew in through the window. Tina warned him it was made with splicing magic. There was a small tube tied to its leg, with a note inside. Tina checked it for poison first. Then Chris unrolled the paper. It read, "Dear little lord, you killed their companion. They would not let this go." Chris's blood ran cold. The companion was clearly Blake, the dark mage Chris had killed that day. But the word that terrified him was they. Not one person, a group. A whole organization of dark mages now had a grudge against him. And they knew exactly where Chris lived and who Chris was. Chris told Tina the whole story about what happened on the road. She pieced it together. Blake had originally poisoned the old Chris, then spotted the Dragon Eye Stone, and Chris had killed him. Now, his organization wanted revenge. Chris felt awkward. Chris just promised Tina 3 months of magic materials. And before Chris could even start, Chris dragged a dangerous enemy to her doorstep. She had every reason to take back her spatial ring and leave. To his surprise, Tina patted his shoulder and told him not to worry. She'd help him fight the dark mages. Chris was relieved and grateful. They agreed to start magic lessons the next day, then said good night. Back in his room, Chris lay in bed, thinking the dark mages lurking in the shadows were unsettling. But Chris could not let fear slow him down. As a transmigrator with the system, his growth speed was far beyond normal. Chris needed to focus on earning reputation, developing his territory, and recruiting more powerful allies. With that plan in mind, Chris drifted off to sleep. The next morning, Chris found Tina and Linda already at the breakfast table, happily eating cream bread. Linda asked if Chris had really invented snow cake, and when Chris confirmed it, both she and Tina gave him 2 reputation points each. Chris told Linda that once she helped him plant fruit trees, Chris could make things even more delicious. Her eyes lit up. Chris asked how long it would take her to grow a sapling into a full fruit-bearing tree. She counted on her fingers and said, 5 days. That was incredible. Natural growth would take a year or 2. His plan was to buy saplings instead of just buying fruit, because planting trees meant jobs for his people, which meant wages and reputation for him. After breakfast, Tina and Chris went outside for his first magic lesson. She handed him a wand and said she'd teach him the basic fireball spell first. She told him to channel his magic power and imagine fire on the tip of the wand. She demonstrated. An orange flame appeared on hers. Chris tried it, and a fireball instantly appeared on his too. Tina's voice cut off mid-sentence. She'd been about to say, it usually takes days or even months to learn this spell, but Chris had done it immediately. Chris tossed the fireball at an empty patch of ground. It exploded, leaving a half-meter crater of scorched earth. Then Chris wondered, could Chris do other magic? The same way. Chris imagined lightning on his wand. A blue electric arc appeared and shot out, shattering a boulder 15 meters away into pieces. Then Chris tried a wind blade, and it sliced clean through a tree trunk thick as a bowl, leaving a mirror-smooth cut. Tina's jaw dropped. She'd taken 3 whole days to learn the fireball when she was a student, and her teacher had praised her as a gifted mage. Yet, Chris had just learned 3 different spells in minutes, figuring out 2 of them completely on his own. She was trembling as she asked if Chris had learned all of those just now. The 3 spells used about 1/5 of his magic power, meaning Chris could cast around 15 spells total. Each one was powerful enough to take down 2 or 3 dozen trainee knights. Tina wiped the sweat from her forehead and asked if Chris had be willing to become her student. Chris looked at this girl, barely 2 years older than him, and told her, no way. Calling someone that young teacher felt like Chris was getting the short end of the deal. Tina got annoyed and revealed she was actually a 4th-ranked mage. Chris was surprised a 4th-rank mage could flatten a small town. That showed just how talented she was. Chris agreed to learn magic from her, but refused to call her teacher. She huffed and turned away. Chris practiced until Chris had used up all his magic power, then stopped. Tina said Chris was only lacking real combat experience now. After resting, Chris gathered everyone in the castle and announced his plan to celebrate his promotion to 1st-rank magic warrior. Chris would give away all the castle's stored food as a free lunch for every person in the territory. Mrs. Ellen asked what they'd eat ourselves. Chris told her not to worry. Chris was sending a knight to City to buy 5,000 pounds of grain. They just needed to keep enough for their own lunch. Chris gave everyone a job. Mrs. Ellen would set up a big cooking pot in the courtyard. Ruth and the maids would help cook. Jonathan and the knights would haul grain from the cellar. Robert would go announce the news across the territory. One knight would ride to City for supplies. Linda asked what she should do, and Chris told her to tend the flowers and plants around the castle and make him a nice garden. She happily ran off without realizing she'd basically been given busy work. Robert went through the territory banging a copper gong, announcing free lunch for all. The people couldn't believe it. Many of them hadn't had a full meal in days. Soon they came streaming toward the castle in groups, carrying chipped bowls, wearing patched clothes, their faces sunken, and their skin yellowish. A huge pot steamed with white bread on top and rice porridge with meat underneath. Jonathan kept the line orderly. Adults got 1 bowl of porridge and 2 breads. Children got 1 of each. When the people saw there was actual meat in the porridge, they nearly cried with happiness. Every person who received food gave him 1 reputation point. With about 200 people in the territory, Chris earned 220 reputation points from this single meal. While everyone was eating, a little girl around 5 or 6 bumped into him and spilled porridge on his robe. Her mother was terrified and dropped to her knees, begging forgiveness. Chris just pinched the girl's cheek and told her not to run around or Chris had spank her. The girl, Vivian, asked if Chris had make the yummy meat porridge again. Her mother panicked at the bold question, but Chris told Vivian that of course Chris would, and someday she'd eat even better things. That earned him 2 reputation points from Vivian and 1 from her mother. Chris went upstairs to change clothes. By the time Chris came back, everything was cleaned up and the people had gone back to work. Chris had planned to go sell snow cake in City again, but with all the money Chris had squeezed from Anthony, Chris had plenty for now. A deafening roar shook the air from somewhere in the distance. Tina came over with a grave expression and told him it was a dragon, an evil dragon. On the magic continent, dragons represent evil and destruction. They burn, kill, and plunder without restraint. Chris grabbed his sword, a fine blade called the green steel sword that the original Chris's father had given him as a coming-of-age gift. Outside, Tina, Linda, Jonathan, and 3 first-rank knights were already assembled. Every fighter Chris had. They followed the roaring to the border with Anthony's territory. There, in the middle of his fields, was a black dragon about 30 meters long, covered in dark scales, with 2 pairs of wings spanning over 20 meters, horns on its head, and burning red eyes. It was spraying fire everywhere, torching Anthony's crops. A knight in silver armor was fighting it one-on-one, dodging its jaws while landing powerful sword strikes. Jonathan estimated the knight was at least 6th rank. The dragon was only in its juvenile stage, a 5th rank magical beast in terms of current power, though by nature, it was ultimately a 9 rank creature. On this continent, dragons grow 1 rank every 10 years without any training. Most get killed young because they can't resist causing havoc early on. Anthony stood off to the side, watching his fields burn, looking like he wanted to cry. He'd just been robbed of all his money by him, and now his crops were getting destroyed. When he noticed him watching, he ordered his bearded knight to push the battle toward his territory. Chris saw through his plan immediately. The fight started, shifting toward his land. Chris asked Linda if they could use the soul crystals to tame the dragon. She shook her head. Even though the dragon was only at 5th rank strength, its soul was that of a 9 rank creature. Those low-level crystals could only handle 3rd rank beasts at most. Chris dropped that idea and assessed their forces instead, with the mysterious 6th rank knight fighting the dragon, plus Tina as a 4th rank mage, Jonathan as a 3rd rank knight, Linda as a 2nd rank mage, him as a 1st rank magic warrior, and 3 1st rank knights. They had a real shot at killing it. Jonathan finally noticed the enemy knights were herding the dragon their way and asked if they should try to stop them. Chris told him to wait. The dragon was being led closer and closer to the border. Anthony's 3rd rank knight was getting hurt badly in the process. When the dragon finally crossed into his territory, Chris drew his green steel sword with the sharp ring of metal. Jonathan asked what Chris was planning. Chris stared at the dragon and said 1 word at a time. Chris is going to slay it. Jonathan tried to talk him out of it. This was a 5th rank magical beast. But Tina said that with all of them working together alongside that 6th rank knight, they could take the dragon. Plus, a dragon's body was full of valuable magic materials. Linda looked eager to fight too. Jonathan saw he was outnumbered and drew his sword. Anthony, watching from his side, was relieved the dragon had left his land and smugly expected it to destroy his. His knights pulled back to rest their injuries, leaving only the 6th rank knight still fighting. The battle had already burned one of his good fields to ash. Chris charged in with his sword in one hand and wand in the other. Tina and Linda were right behind him, and Jonathan brought up the rear with the 3 other knights. 7 of them total. Chris opened with a lightning bolt to the dragon's head. It staggered and roared furiously, then swiped at him with its claws. Chris rolled aside and stabbed at its paw, but his sword just sparked off the scales without cutting through. Its defense was beyond what Chris could break at his level. Linda bound the dragon with massive green vines as thick as a man's thigh. Then Tina floated into the air and unleashed a spell called Magic Storm, an 8-meter-tall tornado of raw magic power that tore into the dragon's scales, peeling them back in large patches. The dragon held in pain. The 6th rank knight seized the opening. His aura blazed as he gripped his sword with both hands and brought it crashing down on the dragon's skull. The impact sent shock waves through the air and slammed the huge head into the ground, leaving a deep crater. Unlike a normal beast that would try to flee, a dragon never runs. It got back up. Jonathan and Chris and the other knights hacked at its exposed spots, opening several bleeding wounds. But this thing was tougher than Chris had expected. Even at 5th rank, its attack and defense outclassed a typical 6th rank beast. The only reason they had a chance was because it had exhausted itself earlier by spraying fire so many times. Chris shouted for everyone to keep attacking and not let it recover. Chris's fireballs at its eyes. The dragon closed its eyelids just in time, and the explosion fizzled against its face. Then it broke free of the vines and counterattacked, swinging its spiked tail like a giant whip across a huge arc, hitting several of them at once. The impact felt like being hit by a car and threw him back over 10 m. Tina and Linda handled it better with their magic shields. The 6th ranked knight pressed harder, keeping the dragon too busy defending to launch another attack. He'd come here to slay this dragon, and with their help, he could see the odds had improved significantly. Over on his side of the border, Anthony and his knights watched with their jaws hanging open. They wanted the dragon to wreck his territory, but instead, it was getting beaten down. Anthony couldn't understand how Chris had a 4th rank mage on his side, or how Chris could use magic at all. His whole worldview was falling apart. Then the 6th rank knight leaped high into the air, his battle aura pouring out endlessly, and shouted the name of his technique, Heavenly Blazing Slash. The 6th rank knight's aura blazed with golden light as he raised his sword, projecting a 5-meter energy blade. The dragon sensed the danger and formed a massive black magic sphere from its horns. The two attacks collided in an explosion of wind and black lightning. The knight's strike cut through and slashed open the dragon's skull, sending blood flowing like a small river. But the dragon wasn't finished. It swiped back with its claws, though the knight dodged in time. Then something unexpected happened. The dragon stabbed its own chest with its claws, opening 3 bloody holes. Tina told him it was using a rare dragon ability called Berserk Mode. The dragon wrapped itself in its own blood, turning its body red and radiating a terrifying aura. Even the 6th rank knight backed away. The dragon gathered crimson light into a 4-meter wide energy ball and fired it at them. The 6th ranked knight threw up a silver barrier. Tina raised a magic shield, and Linda grew hardened trees for cover, but the blast was devastating. It turned everything within 2 kilometers to ash, cracked through all their defenses, and exploded in the middle of their group. Chris was blown dozens of meters away and coughed up blood. Jonathan's armor was cracked. 2 of the 3 first-rank knights were knocked unconscious, and both Tina's and Linda's wands snapped. Anthony was cheering from the sidelines, thrilled to see them getting crushed. They regrouped quickly. Staying together was their only chance. Then Chris decided to try something. Chris channeled all his battle aura into his left palm and formed the silver dragon, a teen dragon subduing palms. Something incredible happened. The moment his aura dragon appeared, the real dragon froze in terror. It sat down, covered its head with its claws, and trembled violently. His battle skill had some kind of natural suppression effect on dragons. The 6th rank knight instantly recognized the opening and shouted for everyone to unleash their strongest attacks. He used Heaven Shattering Slash. Jonathan used Heaven Cleaving Slash. Tina fired a magic tornado, and Linda summoned a deadly trap. His aura dragon struck the dragon's head and blasted open a bloody hole. The berserk state faded, returning the dragon to its normal, weakened form. It took every attack at full force and collapsed, barely alive. Chris sprinted forward and drove his green steel sword into the wound his aura dragon had made. The blade sank in completely. The dragon shuddered twice and went still. 300 reputation points. Everyone gathered around to confirm the kill. The 6th ranked knight was amazed that his battle skill could suppress a dragon. Chris told him. Chris wasn't sure why it worked. Maybe it just did. He introduced himself as Count Ford of Silent Ridge. Chris bowed politely and introduced himself as Baron Chris. He praised him for being so strong at his age, saying his future was limitless. Chris thanked him and stayed humble. Count Ford flipped the dragon over, cut open its soft belly, and pulled out a fist-sized black sphere, the dragon core. He asked if he could take it and leave the rest of the body to him. Chris agreed without hesitation. The dragon core was valuable, but an entire dragon carcass was worth far more. Ford told him to come find him in Silent Ridge if Chris ever needed help, then hurried off. Once he was gone, Chris clapped his hands and said it was time to check their loot. Tina explained what they had. The dragon's fangs had excellent magic conducting properties and could be forged into a dragon. Tooth sword, the perfect weapon for a magic warrior like him. The horns were great magic materials for her and Linda's experiments. The scales and skin could be made into armor, and the meat was edible. Over on his side of the border, Anthony was clenching his fists so hard his nails dug into his palms. By noble law, anything that falls within a lord's territory belongs to that lord. The dragon was entirely his property because it had died on his land, the very land Anthony had pushed it onto. He was burning with jealousy, but couldn't do a thing about it. Then Jonathan pointed at his right hand. Red scales had grown on the back of it, right where dragon blood had touched his skin when Chris drove the sword into the dragon's head. Tina confirmed that only the blood-covered areas had changed. Everyone else tried smearing dragon blood on themselves, but nothing happened. It only worked on him. The system gave him a new task: collect the dragon blood and take a dragon bloodbath. The reward would be a dragon human form. Chris ordered Jonathan to haul the dragon carcass back to the castle, drain all the blood, and collect every drop, even blood-soaked soil from the battlefield. As they carried the enormous corpse through the territory, all his people saw it. They couldn't believe their lord had slain a dragon. The reputation points kept rolling in, over 100 just from the walk home, combined with the 300 from the kill itself. This one dragon had earned him 400 reputation points. Back at the castle, Robert was stunned. Chris told the servants to drain all the remaining blood into a bathtub for him. Chris told Mrs. Ellen they'd be eating dragon meat for dinner. After changing clothes, Ruth told him the dragon blood bath was ready. Chris went to the third-floor bathroom where a huge wooden tub was filled to the brim with red liquid. The smell of blood was overwhelming. Chris told Ruth to keep adding more blood as needed and not to be scared no matter what happened to his body. Chris stripped down and climbed in. The blood felt warm, like a hot spring. Red scales immediately started growing all over his body wherever the blood touched. Chris sank in until only his head was above the surface, looked up at the ceiling and drifted off to sleep without realizing it. When Chris woke up, about half the blood had been absorbed. Chris stepped out of the tub and walked to the mirror to see what had changed. Chris looked in the mirror and could not even recognize himself as human anymore. His entire body was covered in red scales. His fingers had grown sharp claws. A pair of 10-centimeter horns stuck out from the top of his head, and small dark red wings had sprouted from his back. Chris clenched his fist and felt incredible power. His sensitivity to magic and the air was heightened too. Fire elements gathered at his fingertips, and with just a snap, a flame burned in his palm. The system confirmed the reward: dragon human form. Chris estimated his combat power had increased by at least 50%. With a thought, the scales faded, and Chris returned to normal. The form wasn't free though. It constantly burned battle aura or magic power, and at his current level, Chris could only maintain it for about 5 minutes. On his way out of the bathroom, Chris ran into Ruth carrying another bucket of dragon blood. She mentioned that a very strong-looking horse had appeared outside the castle. Curious, Chris headed out. The dragon's carcass had already been processed. Horns removed, scales stripped, skin peeled off, servants collecting the last trickles of blood. Jonathan pointed to a horse a few hundred meters away. It was massive, about 2 meters tall, half again taller than a normal horse, with incredibly developed muscles. The knights were keeping watch on it. Jonathan explained they'd found it while collecting spilled dragon blood from the battlefield. The horse wasn't afraid of people at all, and had followed the knights back, refusing to leave. Chris grabbed a bucket of dragon blood and set it down nearby, then stepped back. The horse walked right up and started drinking. Before his eyes, fine scales grew across its body. 2 bumps rose on its head, and a pair of fangs appeared in its mouth. Chris figured it out. This was a dragon-blooded horse, a horse carrying dragon lineage. That made him wonder if his own body had dragon blood too, since Chris could also absorb dragon blood. But Chris found nothing in Chris's memories connecting his family to dragons. Chris tried approaching the horse, but when Chris got within 3 meters, it spun around and kicked. Chris caught its hoof against his crossed arms, but the force pushed him back over a dozen steps. This horse was 7 or 8 times stronger than a normal one, easily capable of traveling thousands of miles a day, and it could keep getting stronger if Chris kept feeding it dragon blood. Chris decided not to force it and instead sent Jonathan to fetch Linda. When she arrived, Chris asked her to teach him how to use the soul crystal. She drew a strange pattern on parchment and had him drip his blood onto it, which made it glow with colorful light. Next, Chris needed to get a drop of the horse's blood. Chris charged at it with his sword, while 𝗥𝗘𝗕𝗢𝗥𝗡 and 2 knights surrounded it from 3 sides. But the horse wasn't defenseless. The bumps on its head grew into small horns, and red energy gathered into an orange fireball the size of a soccer ball. This horse could use magic. Its combat power was already on par with the first-rank magical beast. Chris wanted it even more now. The dragon-blooded horse was smart. It aimed its fireball at the weakest knight, blasting him aside and creating an opening in their circle. It bolted for freedom. Chris wasn't about to let it escape after it drank his dragon blood. Chris activated his dragon human form. Red scales covered his body. His muscles swelled with explosive power, and Chris launched himself forward like a cannonball, leaving red afterimages in the air. The horse kicked up a wall of dirt behind it, but Chris shot right through without slowing down. It fired another fireball at him, but in dragon form. Chris caught it with one hand and crushed it, flame spilling between his fingers. The horse ignited little flames on its hooves and accelerated even further. Chris beat his small wings, generating a massive burst of thrust that rocketed him above it. Chris landed on its back. It bucked wildly, trying to throw him off, so Chris punched it once on the head, holding back enough not to kill it, and it collapsed, knocked out cold. Chris scratched its neck to draw blood and pressed the soul crystal against the wound. The gray crystal turned blood red. Linda performed the contract ritual. The parchment with his blood floated up, wrapped around the crystal, and melted into it. The unconscious horse twitched, its eyes snapped open, and a red symbol appeared on its forehead. Chris felt a connection form between them like an invisible thread. When the horse stood back up, it didn't resist him anymore. Chris climbed on and pushed it to run. The speed was unbelievable. Flames erupted from its hooves, and Chris estimated they hit around 150 kilometers per hour. The wind was so strong, Chris had to lie flat against its back. It was absolutely thrilling. Back at the castle, Chris tested the soul crystal and recalled the horse into it. A black vortex appeared. The horse walked in, and the vortex shrank back into the crystal ball. Very convenient. The dragon's carcass had been fully drained and butchered by now. Chris asked Robert where the dragon parts were stored and followed him down to the basement. In the first room, Chris found the 2 fangs, each about 1 meter 20 long, still streaked with blood. Along the wall were 16 dragon claws of various lengths, and scattered across the floor were 50 or 60 teeth, ranging from fist-sized to smaller. His plan was clear. The fangs would be forged into a long sword, the perfect weapon for a magic warrior like him. The claws would become short swords and daggers. They weren't magic conducting like the fangs, but they'd be incredibly sharp, enough to arm an elite knight squad. Chris decided the smaller teeth would be made into axes as backup weapons. Chris stored the 2 long fangs in his spatial ring and moved on to the next room. The second room was filled with dragon scales, covering the entire floor, thousands of them, each about palm-sized and 2 centimeters thick, cold to the touch. Chris tested one with his sword and could barely leave a white scratch on it. Armor made from these could block a full attack from any knight below 3rd rank. Chris picked out 100 good ones and put them in his spatial ring, planning to have armor made in M-City soon. The third room had the dragon skin, folded up neatly like a blanket. It was about half a centimeter thick, slippery, smooth, and extremely tough. Combined with the scales, it would make armor that was practically impenetrable. There was also a dragon tendon, thumb, thick, and yellowish. Chris pulled a 10-centimeter piece and stretched it to nearly 50 centimeters. Perfect material for a bow. The penetrating power would be far beyond any ordinary weapon. Robert offered to pick out a good dragon bone later and have a dragon bone bow made for him. Chris appreciated his thoughtfulness. Back outside, 5 ox carts arrived loaded with 100 sacks of grain. The 5,000 pounds Chris had ordered. The knight Shiloh had completed the purchase. The grain merchant asked for 1 gold coin to settle the balance, and Chris flicked one out of his spatial ring. With 2 rings. Now, Chris kept his money on him at all times. Then it was time for dinner. Chris had Ruth call everyone who'd participated in the dragon fight to the dining hall. Mrs. Ellen brought out plates of roasted dragon meat. The smell alone was incredible. Robert, ever the perfect host, raised a toast to him for giving everyone the chance to eat such a rare delicacy. That single toast earned him 16 reputation points from the 8 people at the table. The dragon meat tasted similar to beef, but chewier and incredibly flavorful. The moment Chris swallowed the first piece, warmth spread through his stomach, and Chris felt a surge of strength. His physical constitution was noticeably enhanced. Everyone ate it had the same reaction: rosy cheeks and visibly improved vitality. That triggered another round of reputation points from each person. Chris opened his system panel. His reputation had reached 837 out of 2,000. In just a few days, Chris was already nearly halfway there. At this rate, Chris had reached second rank magic warrior within 2 weeks. Chris ate 2 full plates of dragon meat. His stomach felt like it had a little furnace burning inside, and his strength increased noticeably. Everyone at the table was experiencing similar improvements, especially the knights, whose battle aura grew a bit stronger. Chris made a mental note. If Chris ever got the chance, Chris had hunt more dragons. After dinner, Chris went up to the 4th floor of the castle alone and stared out at his dark territory. Despite today's big victory, the thought of the Dark Mage organization watching him from the shadows made his chest tighten. Tina appeared beside him. As they stood by the window, Chris suddenly noticed something in a large tree in the courtyard. Below, Chris grabbed his wand and fired a lightning bolt at it. A dark shape fell from the branches. Chris used a wind spell to pull it up to them. It was a strange bird, the body of a cuckoo with an owl's head. Another spliced creature clearly sent to spy on him. Chris searched it, but found no letter and no useful clues. Chris was furious. Those dark mages were watching him. Tina laughed softly and told him not to worry too much. She said they were busy with something else and wouldn't come after him for a while. Chris asked her what she knew. She'd clearly dealt with them before. They were the ones who had injured her. She told him everything. The organization was called the 𝗥𝗘𝗕𝗢𝗥𝗡 Society, active in the northwest of the Eagle Kingdom. It had over 100 dark mages, more than 10 of them at 3rd rank or above. Their leader, Edmund, was a 5th rank dark mage, and they kept a 6th rank dragon. Chris felt a chill run through him. Just thinking about the 5th ranked dragon they barely killed today with the whole team. A 6th ranked dragon would be incomprehensibly powerful, and if every dark mage in the group was as strong as Blake, the one Chris had killed, they could each take on a 3rd rank knight and a 2nd rank mage simultaneously. Tina told him they wouldn't bother with him for about a year. After that, Chris had be facing the full force of the 𝗥𝗘𝗕𝗢𝗥𝗡 Society. She suggested Chris could just leave the Eagle Kingdom to avoid them. Chris refused. Chris told her Chris wasn't going anywhere. Chris would destroy the 𝗥𝗘𝗕𝗢𝗥𝗡 Society. Dark mages like them had no place in this world. That earned him 5 reputation points from Tina. Her eyes lit up, and she said she'd fight alongside him until the very end. Chris asked her to handle security around the castle, to sweep the entire territory with magic and eliminate every spliced spy creature. Chris did not want the enemy knowing all his cards before the fight even started. She promised to do a full sweep the next day. The situation was serious. Chris had a powerful enemy that knew everything about him, while Chris knew almost nothing about them. But Chris wasn't alone. Chris had friends, loyal people, and a system that would help him grow faster than anyone thought possible. 1 year was tight, but Chris wasn't giving up. Tina reminded him that Chris needed to recruit more powerful knights and mages before the 1-year deadline, or they'd never stand a chance against the 𝗥𝗘𝗕𝗢𝗥𝗡 Society. Chris agreed, but first, Chris had to develop his territory. Without money and resources, Chris could not support anyone. Chris recruited. She offered to come with him to City the next day and use wind magic to whip the cream instead of having the knight stir by hand. That would be much faster. Chris could not believe Chris hadn't thought of that. That night, Chris sorted his priorities. First, build up industries in Hopetown so the territory could grow and generate reputation. Second, get the dragon materials forged into equipment as soon as possible. Chris was especially curious about what kind of weapon the dragon fangs could become. The next morning, after breakfast, Chris told Linda to come along to City to help him pick out good fruit tree saplings. She agreed enthusiastically, promising she could make anything Chris bought bear fruit within days. Outside, Chris summoned the dragon-blooded horse from its crystal ball. Chris let Tina and Linda ride it while Chris took the chestnut mare. On the road, his mare kept drifting toward the dragon-blooded horse. Jonathan explained that his mare was female and the dragon horse was male. She was attracted to him. The dragon horse wasn't interested and kept glaring at her. But Chris did not stop them. Maybe someday she'd produce a FO with some dragon blood in it. Before reaching the city, Chris recalled the dragon horse to avoid drawing unwanted attention to its scales. They passed through the gates and headed to his rented shop. To his surprise, Baron Raymond's butler, Byron, was waiting outside, looking anxious. He said Raymond was desperate. Chris hadn't come yesterday and his daughter needed her snow cake. Chris apologized and explained Chris had been busy, then promised to sell snow cake every day from now on. Byron urged him to hurry. Chris unlocked the shop, gave Jonathan money to buy ingredients, and politely asked Byron to step outside since the recipe was a trade secret. Byron understood about trade secrets and left, saying he'd return in an hour. Jonathan soon came back with all the ingredients. This time, instead of having the knight stir everything by hand, Tina used her wind magic. She pointed her wand at each basin and created little whirlwinds that whipped the egg whites in. Under a minute, the knights stood there amazed. The whole batch of cream was ready in about 10 minutes, several times faster than before. Chris put Linda in charge of calling out to customers. A pretty young girl shouting about snow cake would attract way more people than a bunch of rough-looking men. Jonathan looked visibly relieved. The embarrassment from last time had clearly scarred him. Linda had a powerful voice that carried for several streets. Unlike 2 days ago, snow cake already had a reputation. Now, repeat customers came rushing in, and soon a line of 20 or 30 people formed at their stall. With more on the way, silver coins clinked in steadily, and reputation points rolled in one after another. Meanwhile, Tina kept producing cream non-stop in the back. Then a squad of city guards in silver armor came pushing through the crowd, scattering the customers. Their leader was a young man in his mid-20s, tall and muscular, who looked a lot like Anthony. This was Howard Hughes, Anthony's older brother, the eldest son of the Hughes family and heir to a Viscount title. Howard demanded to know who gave them permission to set up outside their shop. Chris pointed out there was no rule against it. He claimed they were blocking traffic. Chris shot back that no other shop had lines this long, especially not that red date cake shop, which happened to be his family's business. That was clearly the real reason Howard was here. Chris's snow cake was hurting his sales. He got furious and thrust his spear at their stall. Chris grabbed the shaft with one hand and stopped it cold. He pushed harder, but couldn't move it an inch. He was a second-rank knight. The shock on his face was priceless. After eating dragon meat and unlocking his dragon human form, his raw physical strength now matched the second-rank knight's. Chris shoved the spear forward and sent him stumbling back. He released his battle aura, refusing to believe it. Chris pulled out his green steel sword and wand from his spatial ring and told him Chris wasn't just a knight. Chris was a first-rank magic warrior. He could barely process it. Chris told him that if he was here to cause trouble, he should turn around and go home. Chris mocked him for still being stuck at second rank when the other two Viscount family's heirs had already reached third rank. That hit a nerve. Chris kept going, telling him he should just stay indoors so nobody could laugh at him. Howard went red-eyed and swung his spear at him. Chris blocked with his sword. Sparks flew and the shock wave pushed the crowd back. Before he could attack again, blast of wind erupted beneath him and sent him flying dozens of meters, crashing face first into the ground. Tina stepped out of the shop and said one word: scram. Howard looked at the 4-star badge on her robe, and his face went pale. A 4th-rank mage. He scrambled to his feet and ran. Tina turned back inside without another word. After a brief silence, the customers lined up again, and they went back to selling. Later, Chris found out what Howard did next. He went to his family's red date cake shop on the same street and lost his temper when he learned they'd only sold 3 pieces all day, compared to their dozens of snow cakes at 2 silver each. He ordered his manager Steven to cut the price in half from 20 copper to 10. Then, despite claiming he didn't want to try their product, he ate an entire bowl of snow cake and cleaned it out. After he finished, his face turned red with embarrassment. And somehow, Chris got 1 reputation point from him. Chris could not figure that out. Chris had insulted and humiliated the guy, and he gave him reputation. Chris decided to keep his distance from that weirdo. Chris kept selling, and even had a signboard made with 𝗥𝗘𝗕𝗢𝗥 in small letters and snow cake in big ones. Chris wanted to build his territory's brand. The more people heard about 𝗥𝗘𝗕𝗢𝗥, the more free citizens might come, settle there, and become his subjects, generating reputation. When word came that Howard had dropped red date cake to 10 copper, Chris wasn't worried. Chris's customers were in line for snow cake, and none of them budged. Howard slashed the price again to 5 copper below cost. Steven warned him they'd lose money, but Howard insisted that as a great discount family, he couldn't lose to some country baron. He sent kids running through the streets shouting about the sale. The people in his line glanced up and went right back to waiting. Chris smiled to himself. Trying to beat a 21st century dessert with the price war on red date cakes. Howard had a lot to learn. Howard's price war didn't worry him at all. His red date cake and his snow cake targeted completely different customers. His was just mashed dates stuffed in bread with a little sugar, sold at 3 times the bread price. Chris's snow cake was real 21st century cream, something this world had never tasted. In less than an hour, he sold 80 servings for 160 silver coins and 80 reputation points. Once Chris was sure Howard wasn't a threat, Chris left the shop with Jonathan in charge and took Linda to buy fruit tree saplings. Chris remembered there was a plant market in the East District of 𝗥𝗡𝗕 where free citizens sold their cultivated seedlings. Chris wanted apples, pears, grapes, and oranges, common fruits from his old world that were easy to process. His plan was to teach his people how to make fruit, wine, juice, and jam, building up more industries for the territory. Chris stopped at a money exchange to break 5 silver coins into copper just in case. The plant market was lively with vendors everywhere selling flowers, herbs, and seedlings. They found an apple tree stall first. The seller had over 20 saplings at 20 copper each. Linda carefully inspected them and pointed out 3 defective ones to skip. Even the seller was shocked. He'd been a fruit farmer for over 15 years and couldn't easily spot those rejects. Yet, this teenage girl picked them out instantly. Chris bought the remaining 20. They continued shopping and ended up with 20 apple saplings, 30 grapevines, 50 pear trees, and 50 orange trees. Linda's expertise saved him from buying any bad stock. As they were about to leave, Linda suddenly froze and pointed at something about to shout. Chris clamped his hand over her mouth just in time. On a nearby stall sat a black seed the size of a walnut, oval-shaped and glossy. The vendor, a skinny man, claimed it was a family heirloom called black pearl flower and wanted 20 copper. Chris pretended Chris wasn't interested and started walking away. He chased after them, dropping the price to 5 copper. Chris turned back, tossed 5 coins down, grabbed the seed, and left quickly. Once they were safely away, Chris let go of Linda's mouth. She was buzzing with excitement. It was a magical plant seed with extremely strong magic energy. If Chris hadn't stopped her from blurting that out, the seller would have jacked the price up to 5 gold coins. Magical plants were always sold in gold, not copper. We'd scored an incredible bargain for just 5 copper coins. Chris was thrilled about the 5 copper seed. Linda couldn't identify it yet. She'd need to grow it first to know what kind of magical plant it was. Chris handed it to her for safekeeping. Then Chris heard a familiar voice behind him. It was his older brother, Brent Jordan, the family's eldest son and future 𝗥𝗡𝗕𝗢. He was about 25 and looked a lot like him. He was carrying a potted flower he'd bought. They hadn't seen each other in over a month, so he threw his arm around his neck and insisted Chris come visit grandmother. That worked out perfectly. The family had a mid-level blacksmith Chris could ask to forge his dragon fang sword. Linda wasn't sure whether to follow, but Chris waved her along. They reached the Jordan family's Viscount Manor in about 10 minutes. In a small side courtyard, Grandma 𝗥𝗘𝗕𝗢𝗥 sat in a long chair. She was around 70, with wrinkled skin and white hair, but a warm, kind smile. She grabbed his hands and said Chris looked bigger and stronger than before. When she noticed Linda behind him, she asked if this was his Baroness. Linda's face went bright red, and she quickly denied it. Chris introduced them properly. Grandmother was very fond of Linda and kept holding her hand, looking back and forth between them with a knowing smile. Linda was too embarrassed to look up. Then an annoying voice came from outside. In walked his cousin Plato Jordan, his uncle's son. He was in his early 20s, tall, but stick-thin, with a pointy chin and squinty eyes. He was carrying 5 paper bowls tied together, snow cake from his own shop. He didn't know that. Plato sneered that he'd brought grandmother the most popular treat in 𝗥𝗡𝗕𝗢, 2 silver coins per bowl, and suggested that a poor country baron like him probably couldn't afford it, then mockingly offered him a taste. Linda couldn't hold back. She told him flatly that Chris invented snow cake, owned the shop, and that they ate it every day until they were sick of it. The room went dead silent. Plato stammered and asked if the ancestral secret recipe story was a lie. Chris told him it was just marketing. He asked about the supposed 1 silver coin cost. Chris told him the real cost was 18 copper, 10 times profit. Everyone gasped, especially Brent. As the future Viscount running family businesses, with 2 or 3 times profit margins at best. 10 times was beyond anything he could imagine. Plato was sweating. He tried to recover by mocking him for not bringing grandmother a gift. Brent started to cover for him, saying the potted flower was from both of them. But before he could finish, Chris reached into his spatial ring and pulled out a big chunk of bright red meat. Chris told his grandmother it was 10 pounds of dragon meat. It would strengthen her body and help her live a long, healthy life. Everyone in the room froze. Brent's hand, holding the potted flowers, stopped midair. Plato's eyes went wide. He couldn't believe Chris had dragon meat. Linda casually explained that they'd teamed up with a 6th-ranked knight to kill a dragon yesterday. Plato assumed the knight had just tossed them a few scraps as payment. Then Linda almost blurted out that they'd kept the entire dragon. Chris had to rush over and cover her mouth again. This girl had no filter. If people found out Chris had a whole dragon carcass, everyone would come after him. Grandmother smiled warmly and said she loved any gift from her grandson. She told the servants to cook the dragon meat and insisted they all stay for the meal. Brent and Plato couldn't take their eyes off the meat as it was carried away. In the kingdom's capital, dragon meat sold for 1 gold coin per pound, if you could even find it. Plato kept pressing for details. Linda told him it was a 5th-ranked dragon that could use berserk mode, and that Chris had played the biggest role in killing it, delivering the final blow himself. Both Brent and Plato blurted out in shock. Last they knew, Chris was just an ordinary person. Linda told them Chris was now a magic warrior. Plato refused to believe it. He accused him of having a little girl make up stories and challenged him to a one-on-one duel. Brent shook his head at him, warning him not to accept. Plato was a peak 2nd-rank knight, too strong for a 1st-rank magic warrior. But Chris agreed without hesitation. Grandmother gave her blessing, saying young men should have fighting spirit. Plato and Chris headed to the family's training ground, a field the size of a soccer pitch where house guards usually practiced. The guard captain cleared the area for them. Plato grabbed a sword from the weapon rack and beckoned him forward with a smirk. Chris pulled his green steel sword and wand from his spatial rings and took a fighting stance. He was startled to see Chris had spatial rings, and then noticed Chris had 2 of them. The shocks just kept piling up for him. He told him to attack first. Chris did not hold back. Chris sprinted forward at a speed that surprised everyone, then fired a lightning bolt from his wand. Plato's eyes flashed as he raised his sword to block, confirming that Linda had told the truth. Chris really was a mage. The lightning hit Plato's sword, and the shock traveled straight through the metal into his hand. The idiot didn't know metal conducts electricity. His arm went numb, and his grip shook. The watching guards gasped when they saw him use magic. Sam, the 4th-rank guard captain, list Chris also had battle aura on his sword. Chris was both a knight and a mage. Chris closed the distance fast and brought his sword down on him. He barely recovered in time to block. Their blades clashed with sparks flying, and Chris could tell his strength surprised Plato. Chris followed up with the fireball aimed at his face. He ducked just in time. It singed a few hairs as it flew over his head. Then he jumped back to create distance. The first exchange went his way. But Chris knew. It was because Chris had had the advantage of surprise and his overconfidence. Once Plato took him seriously, things would get harder. He came at him full force, moving like a cannonball. Chris threw a wind blade at him, but he cut through it without slowing down. Their swords met, and Chris felt the difference. Plato's power was like a mountain. Chris was pushed back 3 or 4 steps, while he didn't budge. He pressed his attack relentlessly, swinging his sword so fast Chris could barely keep up. Chris was being driven backward. Chris decided to go bigger. Chris combined wind and fire magic into a blazing tornado. Flame vortex. The heat warped the air around it. Linda shouted from the sidelines that dual-element magic was incredibly difficult and dangerous. Plato countered with a battle skill called Swordblade Storm, spinning his aura into a silver cyclone. The 2 attacks collided in an explosion of fire and wind. When the dust settled, Plato was still standing, though his clothes were scorched and his hair was curled. Then he laughed and said he'd found his weakness. He switched to a 2-handed grip and came at him with pure physical power. Since Chris was fighting one-handed, sword in one hand, wand in the other, Chris could not match his strength. If Chris dropped the wand to use both hands, Chris had lose his magic advantage, and it would just be a 1st-rank knight versus a peak 2nd-rank knight. Either way, Chris lost. He hammered him with heavy strikes. Chris blocked as best Chris could, but each hit sent him stumbling. The guards watching figured Chris was done. Plato landed a devastating kick that sent him tumbling across the ground. He sneered and said a 1st-rank magic warrior was nothing special. Chris looked up at him from the ground, stared him straight in the eyes, and spoke slowly. Dragon human form. His body swelled, muscles bulging, red scales covering his skin, horns growing from his head, and small wings sprouting from his back. Chris looked like a human dragon. Plato stumbled backward in fear. Brent couldn't believe his eyes. The watching guards all gasped. Chris grinned and put away his wand. In dragon form, Chris could cast fire magic with his bare hands. Chris beat his little wings and shot forward, leaving red afterimages. Plato slashed at him, and their swords clashed. But this time, Chris did not budge while he was forced back several steps. His face showed pure shock. Then Chris gathered fire in his left claw, forming a massive fireball over a meter wide. Exploding fireball. It flew at Plato, trailing flames. He countered with a battle skill, projecting a 2-meter silver shield of aura in front of him. The explosion was enormous. Heat waves warped the air, smoke rolled everywhere, and a figure was blasted out of the storm, skidding dozens of meters across the ground. It was Plato. His clothes were shredded, his hair singed, his face covered in soot. Chris won. The whole place went silent. Nobody had expected this outcome. Chris took a deep breath and let the dragon form fade. Scales, horns, and wings disappeared as Chris shrank back to normal. Brent rushed over and grabbed his hand, asking what that was. Chris told him Chris had explained on the way. They left, with Linda following behind. The guard captain, Sam, stared after them and muttered that their family had produced someone remarkable. Plato wiped the ash off his face and swore he'd get him back. Instead of heading to grandmother's for the dragon meat lunch, Chris told Brent Chris needed to see the family blacksmith first. The fight with Plato had shown him exactly how much Chris needed his dragon fang sword. Without it, fighting one-handed with a sword and wand would always leave him at a disadvantage. Brent was confused. Chris already had father's green steel sword. Chris just smiled and said he'd see. They walked to the east side of the manor where Daniel, the mid-level blacksmith, had his forge. Inside, over a dozen shirtless, sweating men hammered away at metal. Linda took one look, shrieked, covered her eyes, and ran back outside. Daniel's senior apprentice, Green, came over and offered to handle his request himself, boasting he was a peak beginner-level blacksmith. Chris pulled a dragon fang from his spatial ring over a meter long. Green's eyes nearly popped out of his skull. He stammered that it was dragon fang, and then scrambled away to fetch his master. Brent stared at the fang in shock and asked if the 6th-rank knight had given Chris this too. Chris just smiled. Daniel arrived moments later, a bald, 2-meter-tall man with 8-pack abs. The moment he saw the dragon fang, he practically ran to him, his hands hovering over it like he wanted to touch it, but didn't dare. Chris shoved it into his arms and told him to examine it carefully and forged him a dragon fang sword as soon as possible. Daniel stared at the dragon fang in his arms like he was in a dream. He'd never seen such incredible material in his entire career. When Chris asked how long it would take, he said the fang was top quality and would need over 10,000 hammer strikes. The earliest he could finish would be tomorrow afternoon before dark. Chris told him to start right away. He led them to his private forge deep inside the workshop, a soundproofed room with an 80-square-meter space, a huge furnace, and a square forging platform. He had his apprentice Green light the fire, and then ordered him to bring out his treasured fire crystals, rare fuel stones that looked like red semi-transparent eggs with something like lava swirling inside. Daniel tossed a dozen into the furnace, and the flames surged, turning from red to pale purple. The dragon fang started glowing red-hot in the extreme heat. Then something unexpected happened. A ghostly shadow rose from the fang. It was a miniature version of the dragon, barely a meter tall, snarling, and baring its fangs. When it looked at him, its eyes burned with hatred. It clearly remembered Chris was the one who killed it. Daniel was trembling with excitement. He said this was an extreme-grade dragon fang, containing the dragon's residual soul. If the forging succeeded, the sword would have a sword spirit. It would only recognize one master, learn that master's fighting style, and provide real combat assistance. Chris asked whether the soul would accept him, since Chris had killed it. Daniel waved that concern away. A residual soul has no intelligence, only instinct. All they needed was to quench the blade with his blood to make it recognize him as its source. Chris activated his dragon human form, pulled out his green steel sword, sliced his wrist, and filled a ceramic jar with his blood. 2 or 3 liters in about 5 minutes. The bleeding left him feeling faint and forced him out of dragon form. But as a first-rank magic warrior, his body was tough enough that it wasn't life-threatening. Daniel was thrilled, saying his blood would raise the sword's quality even further. He pulled the glowing fang from the furnace and poured all his blood over it. Red steam hissed into the air, filling the room with the smell of blood. The dragon's ghostly figure became more solid, wrapped in a layer of red light, its expression turning confused and blank. Daniel raised a heavy black forging hammer and slammed it down on the fang with a thundering clang, shouting, "Return!" The dragon soul looked at him with a mix of emotions, warmth, anger, confusion, struggling internally. After a moment, its expression calmed. It spread its little wings, flew down to the fang, and melted back inside. The rhythmic hammering of the forge began. His sword was being born. Daniel was completely absorbed in his work, hammering the curved fang straighter with each blow. Chris quietly told Brent they should leave him to it. Outside, Linda was pouting about all the shirtless men. Inside, she noticed his pale face and asked what happened. Chris told her it was nothing, just lost some blood. They headed back to grandmother's courtyard. The dragon meat was already cooked and served. Plato had cleaned himself up and shamelessly showed up for the meal too. When grandmother took her first bite, her face turned rosy and she looked years younger instantly. She said it was wonderful stuff. Chris told her to eat plenty, and that Chris had more. She waved him off, saying dragon meat was wasted on an old woman and Chris should save it for young people who could use the strength. Chris told her she'd live to 100 even without it, and got reputation points just for the compliment. Saying nice things earned reputation too. That was a pleasant surprise. Brent and Plato both dug into the meat eagerly. As knights, they could feel the boost immediately. One bite was worth days of training. Their aura practically boiled inside them. 5 reputation points each from both of them. Grandmother asked who won the fight. Plato buried his face nearly under the table. Brent proudly announced that Chris had won. He told grandmother everything, that Chris was a first-rank magic warrior, that Chris gained a dragon human form from killing the dragon, and that his pale face was from giving blood for the sword forging, not from the fight. Plato looked like he wanted to disappear. Grandmother said she hadn't expected him to be so talented, and that maybe Chris could build an even greater family branch someday. She mentioned that even his father had only been a trainee knight at his age. Then she opened up about something Chris hadn't known. She told him not to blame his father for being distant. He was always busy as the family head, but more importantly, he loved his mother deeply. Chris's mother had died from complications while giving birth to him. He'd wanted to die with her, but stayed alive for his children, though his heart had died that day. The original Chris never knew this. He had only wondered why his father treated Brent so much better. Chris told his grandmother he would find a chance to talk to his father and try to fix their relationship. Even though Chris was a transmigrator, hearing about this family history still stung. Then grandmother pulled out a small purple wooden box from her sleeve. Inside, on yellow velvet, lay a pendant, a 5 cm heart-shaped red gemstone, semi-transparent, with a pale blue vortex swirling inside it. It hung on a gold chain. She said her grandfather had given it to her before he died, telling her to keep it safe. It was an heirloom passed down through generations from when the Jordan family had been powerful. Centuries ago, she placed it around his neck and said she saw in him the hope of reviving the family's glory. When Chris touched the gem, it felt warm. Chris could feel energy pulsing inside it, perfectly synchronized with his heartbeat. Brent and Plato both looked stunned. They'd had no idea a family heirloom even existed, let alone that grandmother would give it to him. The heart-shaped gem gave him a strange, warm feeling Chris could not explain. It was already past 2 o'clock in the afternoon, so Chris said goodbye to grandmother and left the manor with Linda. They headed back to the snow cake shop. By then, the customer flow had slowed down. Jonathan reported that they'd sold 220 servings for a total of 440 silver coins. A great day for money, though reputation had only been about 160 points. The problem was that repeat customers didn't generate reputation after their first taste. Chris decided Chris needed to lower both the price to reach more people and develop new products. Earning reputation mattered more than profit right now. Chris had a year to prepare for the Edmund Society. Chris gave everyone 5 silver coins as a bonus, including Tina and Linda. The knights all gave him 5 reputation points each, but the 2 mages didn't. They didn't really care about money, so getting paid didn't make them feel grateful. They locked up and headed home. On the road, Chris noticed the dragon-blooded horse kept drifting toward him rather than the chestnut mare. It wasn't interested in the mare at all. It seemed drawn to him, probably because the blood flowing through his veins now had a dragon element, making them feel like the same kind. Chris decided to name it 𝗥𝗚𝗕𝗢𝗥𝗡, a playful twist on the word dragon. 𝗥𝗚𝗕𝗢𝗥𝗡 snorted, apparently accepting the name. Chris planned to build it a stable next to the chestnut mare. Given enough time to get it, maybe the mare would produce a dragon-blooded foal someday. They passed the peanut fields on the way back. The plants had turned lush and green. Jonathan marveled that his fertilizer method had actually worked. Chris told him this was just basic science, and that they needed to teach all the people to use it. Going forward, this world had been farming for thousands of years without understanding fertilizer. They just rotated fields to let the soil recover. Chris could change that. At the castle, Robert and the servants greeted him at the gate. Chris was still feeling weak from all the blood Chris had given for the sword, so Chris needed dragon meat badly. Mrs. Ellen had prepared a dragon meat dinner. Chris sat down and ate, feeling the strength slowly returning with each bite. Chris told her to make portions for the knights, and both mages too. They had tons of dragon meat in the cellar packed in ice. At his rate of eating, it would last forever. As Chris ate, Chris started missing the food from his old world. In this place, it was meat on a plate every single meal. Back in China, there were 8 major cuisines with endless variety. Frying, steaming, stir, frying, boiling, braising. Chris made a mental note to teach Mrs. Ellen some proper cooking techniques when Chris got the chance. Chris decided to eat dragon meat for a while, and once Chris got tired of it, Chris would sell it in City. Wealthy families would pay a fortune for it. After dinner, Chris had mostly recovered from the blood loss. Chris went out to the courtyard and found Linda examining the soil. She wanted to plant the magic seedweed bought that morning right here, since the dirt was fertile. She warned him that if the plant turned out to be dangerously powerful, it might destroy his castle. Chris told her to go ahead. She dug a hole in the open western side of the courtyard, buried the seed, watered it, and used her wand to speed up growth. A little sprout pushed through the soil. She suggested Chris add some of his blood, since the energy in it would help it grow faster. Chris went into dragon form, cut his palm, and dripped blood onto the sprout. It absorbed every drop hungrily, and grew to over 1 meter tall in about 15 minutes. Chris had to cut himself several more times as the wounds kept healing, stopping only when Chris felt faint again. But something seemed off. The tree looked exactly like the cypress already growing in the courtyard. They stared at each other, wondering if they'd been tricked. Then a single strange leaf appeared at the very top, palm-sized, with golden veins that glowed in the moonlight. Linda's eyes went wide. She recognized it now. Sentinel tree, an extremely rare magical plant. She told him to pick the leaf and hold it over his eyes. When Chris did, his vision completely shifted. Chris was seeing through the tree's perspective. Chris could see himself and Linda standing there as if looking through a camera. Chris could rotate the view, zoom in and out. It was like a 360 surveillance system with perfect clarity. The sentinel tree had no fixed appearance. It automatically copied whatever trees grew nearby, blending in perfectly. If Chris could plant these throughout his territory, Chris would have eyes everywhere. Chris could spot intruders, thieves, or dark mage spies instantly. Linda broke off a branch and stuck it in the ground nearby. She explained that branches from the mother tree could take root and grow into child trees with the same surveillance ability. As long as they protected the mother tree, they could produce endless copies to cover the entire territory. Then something unexpected happened. The tree suddenly turned completely red, grew fine scales on its trunk, and the top began glowing brighter and brighter. A soccer-sized fireball launched from it and slammed into the ground 15 meters away, blasting a meter-wide crater. The power was equal to a first-rank mage's fireball spell. Immediately after, the red faded and the tree went back to looking like an ordinary cypress, gently waving its leaves at him, as if saying, "How cool, Chris is, master." Chris looked at Linda in shock. She was equally stunned. She knew sentinel trees could camouflage, but she had never heard of one that could attack. She said Chris's blood must have caused it to mutate. That made him think about what his grandmother had said, that the Jordan family was once powerful and prestigious centuries ago. Could there be something special in their bloodline that nobody knew about anymore? Linda planted a few more branches from the sentinel tree around the courtyard. Once they grew and developed their surveillance ability, they'd transplant them across the territory. Chris tested the golden vein leaf a few more times, then stored it safely. This magic tree was definitely the best find of the day. Chris gave Linda the dragon Chris stone early as her payment. She teased him, asking if Chris was worried she'd run off with it. Chris told her if she tried, Chris would have her dragged back and make her work for him forever. They joked around for a bit, then Chris headed upstairs. Ruth told him the last of the dragon blood was ready for a bath. Chris went to the bathroom where a full tub of red liquid waited. Chris undressed down to his shorts, keeping the heart-shaped pendant around his neck. The warm blood felt like a hot spring. Chris's dragon human form activated on its own as he sank in, and he drifted off to sleep. What Chris did not know was that the heart pendant began floating above his head, glowing bright red. Blue threads spread from it, while red mist poured out. The two colors spiraled together into an energy vortex that wrapped around him. Chris felt himself falling, sinking through darkness into a bottomless void. Complete emptiness surrounded him. Then a white circle of light appeared ahead. Chris ran toward it and dove through. Suddenly, Chris was standing on a massive wall over 100 meters high, surrounded by soldiers in black armor. Below lay countless corpses. In the distance, an army of hundreds of thousands charged forward. Where am Chris? Chris thought. This had to be a dream, but it felt impossibly real. Chris watched himself draw a sword and command the troops to fight. Catapults launched flaming boulders into the charging enemy. But the army was unstoppable. A black flood of humans, enormous magical beasts taller than 3-story buildings, mammoth elephants, saber-toothed tigers, and 3-meter-tall minotaurs carrying battering rams. Then a dragon's roar echoed across the wall. An ice-blue dragon appeared, about 60 meters long, slender, and elegant, clearly female. She gripped a crystal staff and pointed it at the enemy army, casting a forbidden spell. Mystic Ice Spike Formation. A blue hexagram thousands of meters wide appeared in the sky, and countless 7-meter ice spikes rained down like a storm, impaling everything below. Soldiers, beasts, all of them, were killed in minutes. Then Chris felt himself roar too. The world shrank around him as Chris transformed into an enormous red dragon, over 80 meters long, even bigger than the blue one. Chris called out for the sword to come. A massive red vortex opened above, raining fire that assembled into a 40-meter flaming sword. Chris grabbed it, leaped off the wall, and charged into the enemy army. Nothing could withstand a single swing. Spears and arrows felt like nothing against his scales. Chris cut through them like wheat. Then a woman's voice screamed, "Jordan, save him." Chris turned back toward the wall. 5 black dragons had appeared and were binding the blue dragon in heavy chains. In the dream, Chris screamed the name Lisa and flew toward the wall to save the blue dragon. 3 black dragons intercepted him, each wielding enormous black spears. Chris cut through them with devastating skill, stabbing one through the chest, then casting a forbidden spell called Blazing Sun Crescent. A tiny sun formed in the sky from merged fire and sunlight, and Chris channeled it into a 500-meter golden crescent blade that sliced the 2 fleeing black dragons clean in half. But before Chris could reach Lisa, one of the black dragons on the wall pulled out a scroll. It released a dark, golden light that passed right through his defenses. Black mist seeped from between his scales and connected to a dragon head magic circle on the ground, locking him in place completely. Chris could not move a finger. The remaining black dragons chained Lisa and flew away. Her voice grew fainter and fainter. "Jordan, save him." Chris screamed her name in despair, but could do nothing. Then the entire enemy army retreated, faster than they'd come. The siege had been a diversion. Their real target was the blue dragon all along. Everyone, including him, had been tricked. The vision ended and Chris woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. It was the next morning. Every drop of dragon blood in the tub was gone, completely absorbed. Chris realized this wasn't just a dream. It was the memory of a red dragon named Jordan, the same as his family name. His most painful memory, watching the one he loved get taken away. Chris's dragon human form even produced red scales, just like that red dragon. Was it really just coincidence? And what was so special about the blue dragon that the enemy had sacrificed 3 black dragons and a powerful scroll just to capture her? Too many questions with no answers. Chris let it go for now and check his body. When Chris activated dragon form, he had grown to over 2 meters tall, with much more muscle and 8-pack abs. His wings had grown to the size of swan wings. Chris flapped them and actually lifted off the ground about 1 meter up before hitting his limit. Before, the wings could only boost his speed. Now, Chris could actually hover. Someday, maybe Chris had fly freely through the sky. Chris got dressed and headed to breakfast. Linda excitedly told him the mother sentinel tree had grown to 2 meters, and the first child Tree was over a meter tall. Chris tested the golden leaf over his eyes. The view was much higher now. Incredibly sharp. Chris could see the pores on a maid's face as she walked by. Then the view shifted to the child tree's perspective. The other branches were already 60 or 70 centimeters tall and would be ready for surveillance in a few days. Tina came in asking what they were doing. Chris told her about the sentinel tree they'd grown from the magic seed. Tina grabbed the golden leaf and tried it, but couldn't see anything. Chris took it back, and it worked fine for him. Linda tried too. Nothing. She sighed, and said she shouldn't have let him water the tree with his blood. Now only Chris could use the sentinel tree. Normally, anyone holding a golden leaf could access the view, and mature trees would even grow multiple leaves. But his blood had changed the rules. It was a blessing and a curse. The tree was stronger, but Chris was the only user. Chris made a mental note to be more careful about giving his blood to things in the future. Chris told Linda to start planting the fruit trees after breakfast. Chris promised her that once they bore fruit, Chris had make jam, juice, and fruit wine for everyone. Her eyes lit up. Even Tina looked excited. After eating, Chris sent Tina to City with Knight Shiloh and 3 male servants to run the snowcake business. For the day, Chris gave them a bag of silver coins for supplies and strict instructions to follow the recipe exactly. With Tina, their strongest fighter, Chris kept Jonathan and the remaining knights at the castle for security. Chris pulled out a parchment map of Hopetown and planned where to plant the orchards. Chris picked 2 spots near water sources with open space around them for future processing workshops. Jonathan took a copper gong through the territory, announcing that all able-bodied workers should report to the castle with buckets and shovels for tree planting. Some people grumbled at first. They were worried about leaving their crops unattended with harvest just 2 months away, but someone reminded them that last time the Lord called them to dig pond mud. Everyone got paid 20 copper coins. That changed their mood instantly. It struck him how much had changed in just a few days. When Chris first arrived, the knights had to drag people to work by force. Now, over 140 workers showed up on their own within 20 minutes. The entire workforce of Hopetown. Their motivation had improved dramatically thanks to fair pay, free meals, and being treated like human beings. Chris climbed onto his dragon-blooded horse and called out for everyone to follow. Over 100 people marched behind him in an impressive procession. Some of them wondered why they weren't bringing saplings, but nobody dared ask. They arrived at the spot Chris had chosen, over 100 acres of wasteland covered in waist-high weeds, with a lake of about 300 acres behind it. The reason this good farmland had been abandoned was a second-rank magical beast living in the lake, an iron-armored giant crocodile. Years ago, it had killed several serfs. The Jordan family had sent strong knights to hunt it, but the crocodile was too clever. It never came ashore, and its hide was too tough for ordinary arrows. The knights had given up, and the land had been useless ever since because nobody could draw water from the lake. Today, Chris was going to solve this problem in front of everyone. Chris walked to the lake's edge and tossed a small piece of pork into the water, enchanted with wind magic so it would float. A massive log-like shape drifted over. A whirlpool appeared and the meat vanished. The crocodile was still lurking nearby. Chris threw the rest of the 10-pound piece onto the water and used a wind spell to keep it hovering above the surface. The crocodile couldn't resist. It exploded out of the water in a shower of spray, nearly 4 meters long, thicker than a barrel, covered in black-gray armored plates with teeth longer than human fingers. The crowd stumbled backward in terror. Some people fell to the ground, shaking. Chris asked Linda if she'd gotten a good look. She had. Chris told her to make him a giant fishhook. She planted a seed and grew a half-meter black branch that curved into a hook shape with a barb at the tip and a hole at the base, all in about 3 minutes. Then she grew a 200-meter vine as thick as a baby's arm. By the time she finished, sweat was dripping from her nose. Chris threaded the vine through the hook, tied a tight knot, and impaled 10 pounds of pork on it. The other end of the vine was tied to back, and Chris had all 140 workers grab hold of the line. Chris cast the baited hook into the lake. Within seconds, the vine snapped tight. The crocodile had taken the bait. "Chris!" shouted the count. 1, 2, 3. Pull! Everyone heaved together like a tug of war. The crocodile thrashed and fought, but over 100 people were stronger. When energy started flagging, Chris announced 30 copper coins per person as a reward. Everyone pulled harder. When they slowed again, Chris raised it to 50 copper. That was like injecting pure adrenaline. They hauled with everything they had. They dragged the crocodile a full kilometer from the lake, plowing a deep trench in the ground. Once Chris was sure it couldn't escape back to the water, Chris raised his hand and shouted, "Attack!" Jonathan and the 3 knights charged in and stabbed at the crocodile, but their swords just sparked off its armored hide. Only Jonathan, as a third-rank knight, barely scratched the surface. Then the crocodile swung its tail, thick as a man's waist, and even with all 4 knights blocking together, they were pushed back over a dozen steps. The clever beast stopped struggling and suddenly charged at the crowd of workers. Everyone panicked and let go of the vine, scattering in every direction. The crocodile grinned and turned toward the lake. Alone couldn't hold it. Chris had to admire its intelligence. Chris activated his dragon human form, grabbed his sword, and rocketed toward it like a red blur. Chris formed a half-meter fireball and slammed it into the crocodile's head. The explosion scorched the ground into glass around the impact zone. The crocodile stopped in its tracks. When the flames cleared, its head was blackened and smoking. It turned around furiously and fired 5 water arrows at him. Chris dodged 2, sliced one apart with his sword, and destroyed the other 2 with fireballs. Every attack neutralized. Then it charged at him with its massive jaws wide open. That was actually what Chris wanted. As long as it was chasing him, it wasn't running to the lake. 𝗥𝗚𝗕𝗢 galloped underneath him, and Chris landed on his back. Chris swung his sword and sent a blade of aura straight into the crocodile's open mouth, shredding its tongue. It howled and rolled on the ground in agony. Chris noticed something important. Its belly wasn't armored like the rest of its body. The underside was pale yellow and soft-looking. That was its weak point. Chris sent Jonathan and the knights to block the path to the lake while he switched to a kiting strategy, keeping his distance on 𝗥𝗚𝗕𝗢, who was many times faster than the clumsy reptile on land. The crocodile's only ranged attack was the water arrows, and those were on cooldown. Chris cast a wind tornado that lifted the crocodile 4 or 5 meters into the air, exposing its belly. Then Chris fired 7 or 8 wind blades into its soft underside. Blood poured from the wounds, staining the ground red. From the distance, his people erupted in roars of encouragement. Some of them had lost family members to this very crocodile, and had given up hope of revenge. Today, for the first time, they could see justice was possible. The crocodile gave up fighting and tried to crawl back to the lake, leaving a trail of blood behind it. Jonathan and the knights formed a defensive wall with a silver aura barrier 2 meters high and over 10 meters wide. The crocodile slammed into it head first and staggered backward. Dazed, it tried to go around, but Jonathan shifted to stay in front. It fired 5 water arrows, but they barely rippled the barrier. A third-rank knight plus 3 first-rank knights could easily tank a wounded second-rank beast. Chris gathered his aura into a silver dragon coiling around his body. 18 dragon subduing palms. The dragon dove under the crocodile and flipped it over, exposing its soft belly. 𝗥𝗚𝗕𝗢 and Chris shot forward at full speed, and Chris drove his sword up through the crocodile's jaw, straight through its skull, the blade tip poking out the top of its head. 𝗥𝗚𝗕𝗢 carried him another 200 meters before they slowed to a stop. The iron-armored giant crocodile lay on its back dead. 30 reputation points from the kill, plus 80 more from the watching crowd. But the biggest moment came next. Chris rode into the carcass with sunlight on his face, and announced to everyone that the beast was dead. The land was theirs again, and Chris was treating everyone to crocodile meat for lunch. Every single person cheered and gave him reputation, 140 points total. This had been his real goal, killing the monster publicly, so everyone could see their lord's strength and feel grateful. Then Chris pulled all the fruit tree saplings from his spatial ring. The workers dug holes, planted them, and carried water from the lake. Linda followed behind with her wand, magically accelerating each sapling's growth. Leaves sprouted, and trunks stretched as if years had passed in seconds. Chris organized everything by type: apple orchard, pear orchard, orange grove, and vineyard. The grapes were the most work. Chris had to cut down over 40 trees from a nearby forest to build trellises bound together with vines. Linda grew. By the time they finished, all the saplings were planted across over 40 acres. Linda looked pale from using so much magic. Chris pulled her up onto and told everyone to grab their bowls and head to the castle for meat. Back at the castle, the smell of cooking crocodile meat filled the air. Jonathan presented him with the beast's magic core, a peach-sized water blue sphere. The crocodile skin had been fully peeled off, too. Chris nodded approvingly. Not a bad haul for a morning's work. Linda and Chris went inside the courtyard where the crocodile skin was drying on the stone table. Chris folded it up and stored it in his spatial ring. Chris gave Robert a big bag of coins and told him to pay each worker 50 copper when they came. For lunch, the workers lined up orderly for their bowls of crocodile meat soup. Robert sat by the line, handing out silver coins to pairs of family members. Every person who received payment gave him 2 reputation points. 280 points total from 140 people. Linda and Chris went upstairs to the dining room. Chris sat by the window watching his people outside. They'd sit in small groups, sipping soup and clutching their silver coins with satisfied smiles. Chris tried the soup himself and grimaced. It was fishy and barely salted. Kinda rushed into Ed's salt, then left with Ruth. Then Chris heard a groan beside him. Linda had collapsed backward. Chris caught her and held her up. Massive waves of life energy were radiating from her body, spreading in all directions. Outside, the sentinel trees shot up dramatically, and flowers and grass burst from the sandy ground everywhere, carpeting the earth in green. But Linda was in bad shape. Her eyes were shut tight, her face twisted in pain, and her body was swelling like a balloon. Chris had no idea what was happening and wished Tina were here. There was nothing Chris could do. She screamed that it hurt, then suddenly bit down hard on his hand. His blood dripped into Linda's mouth, and her eyes snapped open with a strange glow. Before Chris could ask what was wrong, she threw her arms around his neck and pressed her lips against his. Energy poured from her mouth into him, incredibly pure and powerful. His dragon human form activated on its own. Linda's swollen body gradually returned to normal as the energy flowed out of her and into him. They stayed locked together, neither of them pulling away. Chris did not know how long it lasted. When the energy finally stopped, they broke apart, gasping for air. Linda's face was flushed deep red. His dragon form had grown significantly. He now stood 2 meters 20, with denser and thicker scales, more developed muscles, and wings nearly 2 meters wide, big enough to actually fly with. Chris asked what had happened. She explained that, as a child, she'd accidentally eaten something called a dragon tongue fruit containing enormous energy. Her teacher had sealed it inside her just in time to save her life. Today, she'd used too much magic planting the trees, which triggered a stress reaction that cracked the seal. The energy had started leaking out uncontrollably. By kissing him and transferring the energy, the threat was gone. She couldn't feel the dragon tongue fruit's power inside her anymore. It was a win for both of them. She was free of a ticking time bomb, and his dragon form had gotten a major upgrade. Chris checked his pocket watch. It was already 3 o'clock in the afternoon. They'd been locked together for nearly 3 hours. She mumbled that she was tired and practically fled to her room. Chris watched her go, then licked his lips. In 2 lifetimes, Chris had never kissed a girl before. That was his first kiss. Chris stretched and went downstairs. The sentinel trees had all grown significantly. The mother tree was 2 meters tall, and all 6 child trees were over a meter. Chris tested the golden leaf and confirmed every child tree now had surveillance capability. Chris needed to transplant them to key locations across the territory soon. It was time to check on his dragon fang sword. Chris called, mounted up, and told Jonathan Chris was going to City alone. He protested it was dangerous, but Chris patted his neck and said danger couldn't catch him. They took off in a cloud of dust and reached the city in under 30 minutes, at 160 kilometers per hour. On the way in, Chris ran into Shiloh and Tina's group heading home. They'd sold 200 snow cakes, decent money, but only 30 reputation points. The novelty was wearing off fast. Chris definitely needed new products soon. Chris gave each person a bonus and sent them home. At the Viscount Manor, Brent was already waiting outside the forge. He wanted to see the dragon fang sword too. They knocked on the iron door, and Green let them in quietly. Daniel was at his anvil blazing, hammering the blade with precise strikes. On the forging platform lay a pale white sword that looked like it was carved from jade. A true work of art. The blade was about 1 meter 20 long and 3 fingers wide. The guard was shaped like 2 outward-pointing fangs. With one final strike, brilliant light erupted from the blade, flooding the entire forge. Then a rainbow beam shot from the sword straight through the ceiling, blasting a half-meter hole. Through it, they could see blue sky. A dragon phantom over 10 meters long rose into the air above them, opened its jaws, and let out a roar so powerful it shook the entire city like a small earthquake. Then the phantom turned into a streak of light and sank back into the blade. The sword flew to him on its own, handle first, and hovered in front of him. Chris grabbed it. The grip felt cool and comfortable. Inside his mind, Chris could sense the sword's spirits, thoughts, cheeky and mischievous. Every time Chris swung the blade, it let out a deafening dragon roar. Daniel was weeping with joy, saying this was the greatest weapon he'd ever forged. The roar had a soul-shaking effect that could stun enemies in combat. And even if a strong opponent could resist it, constant roaring right in their face would drive them crazy. Green presented a light gray scabbard carved with a silver dragon in flight. Chris loved it. Daniel asked him to name the sword. Chris thought about the roar it made with every swing and decided, Dragon's Howl. The sword trembled slightly in approval. Then Chris pulled out a section of dragon skin and over 100 dragon scales from his spatial ring and asked Daniel to forge him a suit of armor. Brent stood there looking numb. He'd run out of ways to be shocked. Daniel's eyes lit up as he ran his hands over the scales and said it would be his pleasure. Green started measuring him for the armor, height, shoulders, waist. Daniel laid the dragon skin and scales out on the forging platform in a rough human shape. Then something unexpected happened again. A cold aura rose from the dragon's skin, and another dragon phantom appeared, glaring at him with hatred and roaring. A second dragon soul. This one had been hiding in the skin. Dragon's Howl unsheathed itself automatically, its sword spirit floating out to face the new phantom. They looked almost identical, but the sword spirit was more solid. One had already accepted him as master, the other still hated him. Brent looked at him with envy and asked why all the good things happened to him. Chris told him it was called main character energy. Chris activated his dragon human form to give blood again. Everyone stared. Chris had grown dramatically since yesterday, now standing at 2 meters, 20. Brent complained that one day apart, and Chris had changed this much. They didn't know about the dragon bloodbath and the energy Chris had absorbed from Linda. Green brought him a cup, but Chris shook his head. Too small. He came back with a bucket. Chris cut his wrist with Dragon's Howl and bled out over 10 liters. Before feeling faint, his enhanced body could handle far more blood loss now. Green poured it evenly over the dragon's skin. The blood absorbed instantly, and the phantom's expression shifted between anger and warmth, just like the first soul had. Eventually, the hatred faded, replaced by calm acceptance. It sank back into the skin. The sword spirit returned to Dragon's Howl. Then, Chris pulled out the crocodile skin and asked Green to make him some shoes. Brent couldn't believe Chris had killed the iron-armored crocodile. Then he realized Chris was using second-rank beast leather just for footwear and called him extravagant until he remembered Chris had dragon skin for real armor. He asked if he could have the leftover crocodile skin for his own armor. Chris told him 12 gold coins. He protested that they were brothers. Chris said brothers settle accounts clearly. After some haggling, Chris threatened to sell it to Howard's family for 15 gold. He caved and paid 12. Chris also offered him the crocodile's water magic core since it conflicted with his fire-aligned dragon form 15 gold coins. He called him a robber, but when Chris mentioned selling it to his rivals instead, he agreed instantly. He'd pay tomorrow when Chris came to pick up the dragon scale armor. Green measured his feet for the shoes and assured him there was plenty of crocodile skin, enough for 2 full sets of armor, plus extra shoes. Brent would get his armor. Chris would get his 5 pairs of shoes, and maybe even 2 more pairs from the leftover material. Brent insisted Green make him 2 full sets of armor and use whatever was left for his own shoes. Chris did not argue. 5 pairs was plenty for him. Chris headed out with Dragon's Howl in hand. For some reason, the sword spirit refused to go into the spatial ring and insisted Chris carry it. Outside the forge, a crowd had gathered. Father, Uncle Fred, Plato, and every houseguard. The dragon roar earlier had alarmed the entire estate. Father asked what happened. Chris told him straight. Chris had had a dragon fang sword forged, and the sword spirit made a scene. Plato sneered, suggesting it was a real dragon coming for revenge. Chris drew Dragon's Howl and swung it a few times. Every swing released a thundering dragon roar that nearly deafened everyone. Father's eyes burned with desire. He actually tried to sweet-talk him into handing it over, claiming Chris was too young to handle it. Chris told him the sword was quenched with his blood. The spirit would only ever recognize him. His face fell. Then Chris mentioned Chris had killed the iron-armored crocodile and sold the skin to Brent for armor. Father and Uncle Fred were stunned. Uncle Fred, a 4th-rank knight, had led a whole squad against that crocodile years ago and failed. When Chris pointed out that Brent was probably already having armor fitted, Father vanished in a blur, smashing through the forge door to claim his share. Outside the manor gates, hundreds of people had gathered. The city's most important nobles and merchants. The two other Viscount family's leaders were there, demanding to know about the dragon roar. Chris played dumb, pretending to be a scared kid who'd run out when he heard the noise. They bought it and pushed past him to find Father. As Chris squeezed through the crowd, a blond young man grabbed his shoulder. He smiled and said his sword looked unusual. Chris brushed him off, calling it ordinary, and left quickly. Behind him, Chris heard the blonde woman with him ask what he'd noticed. He said it was a dragon fang sword. Outside the city, Chris released 𝗥𝗚𝗕𝗢𝗥𝗡 and rode hard toward home. Then an arrow came whistling at him. Chris drew Dragon's Howl and sliced it out of the air. 𝗥𝗚𝗕𝗢𝗥𝗡 stumbled over a hidden rope on the ground, though he didn't fall. Two men who had been holding the rope were yanked out of their hiding spots. They couldn't stop a dragon-blooded horse. 8 figures emerged from the bushes. Their leader was a short, fat man, about 1.40 meters tall. Beside him was a man with a hideous scar across his entire face. Scarface had a high-pitched voice and pointed out his noble clothing, his valuable horse with scales, and suggested Chris would fetch a nice ransom. The fat leader grinned and made a disgusting suggestion about keeping him for their entertainment. They formed a circle around him. 2 second-rank knights and 6 first-rank knights total. Chris let out a cold laugh and asked them if they really thought that was enough to rob him. Scarface taunted him, calling him a kid who didn't know what he was getting into. One of the first-rank knights swaggered toward him with a disgusting threat. Chris did not bother with words. Chris charged on 𝗥𝗚𝗕𝗢𝗥𝗡. Dragon's Howl roared as Chris swung, and the man's head flew off his shoulders. One strike, instant kill. That got their attention. The fat leader ordered everyone to attack at once. 7 men drew their weapons and rushed him from all sides. Chris fired a lightning bolt through Dragon's Howl straight into Scarface. The dragon fang sword conducted magic even better than a regular wand. The bolt was as thick as a baby's arm. Scarface went into convulsions. The fat man barely saved his partner by deflecting Chris's follow-up thrust, then kicked at 𝗥𝗚𝗕𝗢𝗥𝗡 belly. 𝗥𝗚𝗕𝗢𝗥𝗡 reared up and kicked back, pushing the fat man several steps, then fired a fireball from his forehead right into the fat man's face. While he was blinded and crying from the burns, Chris swung Dragon's Howl at his head. Only his battlefield instinct saved him. He ducked just in time, the blade whistling over his scalp. The fat leader screamed for everyone to use their battle skills. All 7 attacked with name techniques. Chris felt his blood boil with fighting spirit. Dragon human form. Chris tossed his shirt into the spatial ring as his body surged to 2 meters. 20 covered in red scales. Dragon wings spreading wide behind him. Dragon's Howl extended a meter-long energy blade that matched his new size perfectly. Chris beat his wings and flew up, gathering fire elements at the sword's tip. Exploding fireball, a 1.20 meters fireball, formed instantly, far more powerful than anything Chris had produced before. Thanks to 2 upgrades to his dragon form, plus Dragon's Howl's superior magic conductivity, Chris launched it into the middle of Scarface's sword dance technique. The fireball shattered into dozens of burning fragments that scattered everywhere, interrupting 6 of the 7 fighters at once. Their battle skills were broken. Scarface had to retreat with burned hair and scorched skin all over his face and body. Only the fat leader made it through. Chris flew at him and swung Dragon's Howl upward. Their weapons collided with a thundering clang, sending visible shock waves rippling through the air and flattening the surrounding grass. The fat leader stumbled back over a dozen steps, completely stunned. He was one of the strongest second-rank knights around, yet Chris was overpowering him. He was already regretting picking this fight, but it was too late to negotiate. Within speed, they couldn't even run. Chris fired lightning at him. He dodged by rolling sideways, but before he could get up, Dragon's Howl was already thrusting at him. Every strike targeted a vital point. He blocked desperately, sweating and barely surviving each exchange. Scarface shouted for the others to go help their leader. Then a red blur streaked past him, followed by a horrible scream. Scarface turned and saw that 𝗥𝗚𝗕𝗢𝗥𝗡 had gored one of his men with his horns, tossing him 100 meters through the air, with a hole ripped through his stomach. Scarface charged at 𝗥𝗚𝗕𝗢𝗥𝗡 in a rage, but the horse simply sprinted away. At 200 kilometers per hour, nobody could keep up. Scarface chased him for a mile before giving up, gasping for breath. Then he realized he'd left his leader alone with him and ran back. Meanwhile, the fat leader was barely surviving. Dragon's Howl's constant roaring had nearly deafened him, crippling his ability to sense danger. He was covered in wounds, blood soaking his clothes. Chris unleashed 3 spells in a row: lightning, wind vortex, and an exploding fireball. Scarface arrived just in time and threw up a 3-meter aura barrier. His lightning cracked it, the wind expanded the cracks, and the fireball shattered it completely, sending both of them tumbling. From the distance came screams. 𝗥𝗚𝗕𝗢 was playing with one of the knights, tossing him into the air with his horns, catching him, tossing him again, then finally stomping his head. The horse fired fireballs at the other 3 knights to keep them back. The survivors broke and ran in every direction. The fat man and Scarface looked at each other and bolted too. Chris flew up on his wings and formed a silver aura dragon. A teen dragon subduing palms. The dragon crashed down on both of them, blasting a crater 100 meters wide and 3 feet deep. Chris dove down and drove Dragon's Howl through Scarface's chest. He died instantly. The fat man went berserk, abandoning all defense to swing his blade at him in a suicide exchange. Chris fired a lightning arc at his wrist. His weapon dropped. Dragon's Howl pierced his heart, the blade erupting from his back. His body slid down the sword and split apart. 𝗥𝗚𝗕𝗢𝗥𝗡 caught and killed another fleeing knight. Chris flew after the last 2 himself. One thought he'd escaped. Then Chris's sword took his head before he even heard him coming. The other heard hoofbeats behind him and ran harder, only to find 𝗥𝗚𝗕𝗢𝗥𝗡 suddenly in front of him. A hoof to the skull ended it. Chris flicked the blood off Dragon's Howl. The blade was spotless. 𝗥𝗚𝗕𝗢𝗥𝗡 could have outrun all of them easily, but this was the road to his home. Chris would never allow bandits on the path to Hope Town. Chris sheathed his sword, climbed back onto 𝗥𝗚𝗕𝗢𝗥𝗡, put his clothes back on, and headed home. After Chris left, the blonde man and woman from the city arrived on horseback. The woman rode an impressive beast, a blue-scaled horse with a rainbow tail and a single horn like a rhinoceros. The young man inspected the scene and the bodies. He noted the wounds were clean and precise, made by an extremely sharp weapon with burn and paralysis marks, confirming the attacker was a magic warrior. Only 1 set of human footprints, plus deep hoof prints from an exceptional mount. His sister asked if the horse was better than her rare blue-scaled unicorn horse. He laughed and said it was many, many times better. After Chris left, those 2 blonde siblings investigated the battlefield. The young man, Doyle, figured out everything from the evidence. The clean sword wounds, the burn and paralysis marks from a magic warrior, only 1 set of human footprints and deep hoof prints from an exceptional mount. He deduced that 4 of the 8 bandits had been killed by the horse alone, making it comparable to a peak first-rank knight in combat power, with speed around 200 kilometers per hour, double the woman's prized blue-scaled horse. The woman, Manda, couldn't believe it. Doyle suggested it was him, Chris Jordan, with a dragon fang sword. Manda refused to believe it. She remembered him as a snotty little kid who used to chase after her, yelling, "Manda, wait for me." She couldn't connect that child with someone capable of killing 2 second-rank knights and 6 first-rank knights alone. They made a bet. They'd stake out the road to M City, and if Chris showed up riding an extraordinary mount, Doyle won and got to borrow her blue-scaled horse for a month. If not, Manda won and got his treasured mystic iron or for forging a sword. She agreed confidently, certain Chris could not have grown that strong in 6 months. By the time Chris got home, it was fully dark. The fight with the bandits had cost him too much time. Jonathan smelled blood on him and asked what happened. Chris told him it was nothing, just some roadside bandits Chris had dealt with. He offered to accompany him in the future, but Chris turned him down. He'd only slow him down. Tina met him inside and asked what had happened between him and Linda. Apparently, Linda had locked herself in her room and refused to come out since Chris had arrived. Chris licked his lips and said to give her a couple of days. Then Tina shared some good news. Linda had advanced to 3rd-rank mage. That was huge. A 3rd-rank plant mage would dramatically speed up everything in his orchards and farmland. It made sense though, when the dragon tongue fruit energy leaked out. She would have absorbed some of it herself. Chris went to the dining room, starving. Mrs. Ellen brought out the usual, dragon meat steak. Chris stared at it and gazed. After days of nothing but plain meat on a plate, Chris was sick of it. Chris stood up, walked into the kitchen, and decided it was time to teach Mrs. Ellen how to cook real food from his previous life. Chinese cuisine had 8 major styles. Any one of them could fill a feast. Eating bland steaks every day was barbaric. The servants panicked at seeing a noble in the kitchen. Robert was summoned to protest, but Chris stopped him before he could speak. Chris told Mrs. Ellen Chris had cook, and she'd watch and learn. Once she mastered it, Chris had stopped coming. Chris picked up the jars and bottles on the counter, sniffing each one to identify the seasonings. The selection was pitiful compared to his old world. Just oil, salt, pepper, and cumin. But it was a start. Chris rolled up his sleeves and started cooking. Chris cut pork into small pieces and tossed them into the oil pan. When the meat turned white, Chris added chopped cabbage. Mrs. Ellen was horrified. Cabbage was servant food, and nobles only ate meat. Chris ignored her and kept stir-frying. Everyone watched in stunned silence. They'd never seen a noble cook before, let alone with techniques completely foreign to this world. As the food sizzled, the aroma drifted out of the kitchen. Ruth and Kina were practically drooling. Chris made pork stewed with cabbage, beef stewed with potatoes, pepper, stir-fried pork, and scrambled eggs with tomatoes. Chris wished Chris could do more, but his stomach was growling too loudly. Chris whittled 2 straight sticks into chopsticks with dragon's howl, washed them, and sat down to eat. The flavors were solid. His cooking skills had not faded one bit. Chris made Mrs. Ellen taste the food. She resisted at first, thinking it was wrong for a servant to eat what her lord cooked. Chris pushed the spoon into her hand and told her she needed to learn these recipes so she could make them for him later. One bite, and her eyes lit up. Every dish earned him 2 reputation points from her. Chris called the maids in to try it too. They were amazed. Every one of them gave him 2 reputation points. Tina quietly slipped in and tasted it as well, earning him 2 more. Chris asked about Linda. Tina said she was still hiding in her room. Chris told Tina to bring the pork and cabbage to Linda's door. That would get her out. Sure enough, when Linda smelled it and heard it was something Chris had cooked personally, she cracked open her door. One bite and the little food lover was hooked. Tina lured her to the dining room with the promise of more dishes. Linda sat as far from him as possible, head down, not saying a word. Chris told her to eat. She cautiously tried a piece of beef and looked up with shining eyes. 2 more reputation points. Chris did not push things. Chris just focused on his own food. Chris was starving. Tina noticed his chopsticks and asked what they were. She and Linda had been struggling with spoons, spilling food everywhere, while Chris was picking up even tiny crumbs of meat without dropping a single piece. Chris told them chopsticks were something Chris had learned from a foreign merchant last year, almost slipping and saying, "Past life." Chris handed them each a pair Chris had already prepared. They fumbled at first, but as mages with strong mental focus, they got the hang of it within 5 minutes. Linda picked up a piece of potato and said through a full mouth that chopsticks were definitely better than knives and forks. That night, Chris had the most satisfying meal since arriving in this world. The 4 plates were licked clean by the 3 of them. Chris went to bed exhausted. After Chris left the dining room, Tina cornered Linda and squeezed the whole story out of her. The dragon tongue fruit, the energy leak, biting his hand, drinking his blood, and the 3-hour kiss. Linda was mortified. Tina teased her about being so forward, and joked that since his blood made the sentinel tree loyal to him alone, maybe drinking it had made Linda fall for him too. Linda insisted that was ridiculous. She wasn't a plant, but she couldn't explain why she'd kissed him. The next morning, Chris sent Tina and Shiloh to City with the servants to sell snowcake as usual. Then Chris gathered all the workers again. Today's job was building processing sheds near the orchard, 10 buildings with a large stove for making fruit jam. Once the harvest came in, Chris had them cut down trees and start construction while the administrator, Randall, recorded everything. Linda was out with her wand, casting growth spells on the fruit trees one by one. The saplings planted just yesterday had already grown noticeably bigger, with thick leaves and some even blooming flowers. Chris used wind magic to scatter the pollen for artificial pollination. At this rate, they'd have fruit in 5 days, something that would normally take a year or 2. Then a man shouted from the lakeshore that he'd found a huge egg, melon-sized and oval. Before Chris could react, the crocodile's jaws burst from the water and dragged him under. Another iron-armored crocodile. Chris sprinted to the lake with dragon's howl drawn. The water was bubbling with blood. Chris spotted the target and hurled his sword into the water. Moments later, the man surfaced. Chris went into dragon form, flew out over the lake, grabbed him, and tossed him to shore. Saving his life earned him 60 reputation points. He passed out immediately. He had bite marks, was in shock, and had lost a lot of blood. His friends rushed him away for treatment. Dragon's howl flew back to his hand from the water. This crocodile was much smaller and weaker than yesterday's. Probably just a first-rank beast. And given the egg, this one was female. The big one Chris had killed yesterday must have been her mate. The Jordan family's headache had apparently been a married couple. Chris fired lightning into the lake. But while plenty of fish floated up, belly up, the mother crocodile was nowhere to be seen. Chris realized electrifying the whole lake would ruin the fish population. So Chris decided to go in himself. Chris dropped into the water, in dragon form. 2 small whiskers grew from his nostrils that let him breathe underwater. Yesterday's crocodile had been second rank, too risky to dive after alone. But this one was only first rank. Chris could handle it easily. Chris opened his eyes underwater and could see everything clearly. Small fish darted past him in panic. Chris kept diving deeper. The mother crocodile had probably retreated to her den at the bottom. The lake bottom was dim and murky. Chris gripped Dragon's howl tightly, cutting through water weeds as Chris descended. The lake was about 100 meters deep. After 4 or 5 minutes of searching, Chris found her. At the bottom, there was a nest made of water plants and lily pads, about 7 or 8 meters across. The mother crocodile was curled up inside with a wound on her back from his earlier sword throw, still bleeding. Around her were over a dozen white eggs, floating gently in the current. A nursery for future baby crocodiles. She was much smaller than her mate, only 2.5 meters long, and quite slender. When she spotted him, she raised her head with a fierce look. Chris charged at her with Dragon's howl. Chris sent a whirlwind from the sword tip that turned into an underwater vortex, spinning her body out of control. While she was disoriented, Chris sliced her soft belly open. Her combat ability was nothing compared to yesterday's male. Chris had struggled against him, even with Jonathan's help. This one Chris could handle alone without breaking a sweat. But Chris needed to hurry. His dragon form only lasted about 10 minutes now. After 2 upraids, Chris attacked relentlessly. Dragon's howl was sharp enough to cut through even her armored hide. Within minutes, she lost all ability to fight back. Up on shore, Jonathan and the others had been watching the lake anxiously, seeing red blood float to the surface. Linda covered her eyes, afraid to look. Then the mother crocodile's massive body burst out of the water and crashed onto the bank, covered in wounds and barely alive. Chris flew out after her, landing gently without a scratch. The crowd cheered, and his reputation climbed by another dozen points or so. His total was now 1,710, just 290 away from 2,000 and the breakthrough to second-rank magic warrior. Chris casually said to prepare for skinning. Then Linda stopped him and asked if Chris had found any eggs. Chris told her Chris had brought all of them up, joking about reuniting the family on the dinner table. But Linda had a much better idea. Why not put the mother and eggs back in the lake and breed crocodiles? The lake was big enough to serve as a crocodile farm. Whenever Chris wanted crocodile meat or leather for shoes, Chris had just catch one. Jonathan pointed out that nobody would dare fetch water from a lake full of crocodiles. Chris already had a solution. Dig a narrow channel from the shore to the lake, 1 meter wide, 2 meters deep, and 30 meters long. The workers could draw water safely from the channel. The mother crocodile was too big to fit inside it, and her cautious nature meant she'd never venture 30 meters from the lake. Then Jonathan pointed out a problem Chris hadn't considered. The mother crocodile was nearly dead. Chris had been planning to skin her, so Chris hadn't held back at all. She was barely breathing. Chris panicked and asked Linda for a healing plant. She pulled out a tiny green seed from her pouch, planted it, and grew a meter-tall plant with 4 fist-sized green pods full of liquid. They picked the pods, squeezed out the cool green medicine, and smeared it all over the crocodile's worst wounds. Linda grew 7 or 8 more plants, and they used every drop on the dying beast. After about 15 minutes of treatment, thick green paste covered her body, and she was finally stabilized. Chris had Linda bind her with tough vines just in case she woke up aggressive. Chris had the workers dig 2 channels from the shore to the lake, 1 meter wide, over 2 meters deep, and 30 meters long. Once the mother crocodile recovered, Chris untied her and put her back in the lake along with all her eggs. Chris watched her carefully carry each egg down to the bottom. The crocodile farm was officially in business. The orchard construction continued all day. Chris fed the workers lunch again and kept them going through the afternoon. But reputation from the workers had dropped to only 80 points today. People get used to things and gratitude fades. Same thing was happening with 𝗥𝗘𝗕𝗢𝗥𝗡 in 𝗥𝗘𝗕. Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Chris rode toward 𝗥𝗘𝗕𝗢𝗥𝗡. On the way, Chris burned the bandits' bodies that were still lying on the road. As Chris approached the city, Chris spotted 2 riders coming toward him, a blonde brother and sister on horseback. The White family twins, Doyle and Manda. In the old Chris's memories, Manda had been his dream girl since childhood. He used to follow her everywhere, and before his coming-of-age ceremony, he even begged his father to propose marriage to the White family. Father refused, saying Chris wasn't worthy of her. She was a third-rank knight, one of the strongest in her generation, while Chris had been just an ordinary person with no battle aura. Every time he traveled hours to 𝗥𝗘𝗕𝗢𝗥𝗡 to see her, she'd slam the door in his face. But Chris wasn't that lovesick puppy anymore. Doyle greeted him warmly. Chris responded coldly. "What do you want?" Manda frowned. She was used to the old Chris fawning over her, not this indifference. Doyle complimented, clearly checking whether he'd won his bet with Manda. Then, without warning, Manda drew her sword and charged at him. Chris pulled Dragon's Howl from his ring and blocked with the scabbard. The collision sent sparks flying. The recoil surprised her. She hadn't expected this kind of strength from him. Chris shoved her back and asked what she was doing. She attacked again. Chris drew Dragon's Howl and its roar shook the air. Both siblings' faces changed. They hadn't expected a sword with special effects. Chris struck first with lightning through Dragon's Howl. She blocked with her metal sword. Bad move. The current paralyzed her and even shocked her blue-scaled horse underneath her. Dwagon charged in and gored the horse's neck with his horns, punching 2 bleeding holes. Manda was thrown off as her mount collapsed. Chris followed up with 3 wind blades. She sliced them apart, but spun and kicked her with his hind legs. She blocked with her sword flat, but the impact sent her sliding back over 10 m, carving trenches in the ground. Chris fired a fireball. She drove her sword into the ground and raised a circular aura shield called Holy Light Barrier. The fireball splashed against it, buying her a moment to breathe. Then she poured everything into her sword and announced a battle skill. Void Flash. From the distance, Doyle screamed, "Are you crazy?" Manda's killing intent locked onto him like a cage. The sword energy tore up everything around them. This was the real power of a third-rank knight. The pressure of death itself. Chris activated his dragon human form, pushed his focus to its absolute peak, and launched everything Chris had. 18 dragon subduing palms. A silver dragon coiled around him. Exploding fireball. A massive fireball formed at the tip of Dragon's Howl, drawing fire elements from 200 meters around. Manda pulled her sword from the ground. Her golden hair floated upward as dark energy wrapped around the blade like a void. She slashed, sending a black crescent of terrifying power at him. Chris released the aura dragon, carrying the fireball to meet it head-on. The collision was catastrophic. Fire rained from the sky. The ground cracked in every direction, and dust filled the air. His aura, dragon and fireball shattered, but Manda's black crescent kept coming. Though much weaker now, Chris flew up to keep Dwagon safe, poured every last drop of aura and magic into a layered shield, and braced for impact. The shield cracked, splintered, and broke apart. Dragon's Howl flicked upward and scattered the last trace of the attack. But Chris was completely drained. Dragon form collapsed. His clothes disintegrated, leaving him in nothing but stretchy shorts. Doyle could not believe Chris had survived. Manda screamed and covered her eyes, her face turning bright red. She'd gotten an eye full of him in his underwear. Chris pulled spare clothes from his ring, told them to stop bothering him, and rode off on. Reflecting on the fight, Chris could clearly see the gap between him and a third-rank knight. Chris dominated early by catching her off guard, but once she got serious, Chris was outmatched. Blocking her final attack had emptied his entire reserves. While she still had energy to spare, Chris needed to reach second rank as soon as possible. Later, Doyle asked Manda how much power she had used. 8 out of 10, more than the 7 she usually used when sparring with him. He was shaken. Manda, meanwhile, was fixated on something else entirely. The way Chris had looked at her, the old Chris had worshipped her. Now, there wasn't a trace of affection in his eyes. Chris headed to the Viscount Manor to check on his armor. In the forge, Brent was admiring himself in a mirror, wearing his new crocodile skin armor. He bragged that even his sharpest sword could only scratch it without battle aura. Chris responded with minimal enthusiasm. Green brought him his first pair of crocodile skin shoes. They fit perfectly, smooth and comfortable, like a foot massage. Chris bounced around testing them. The other fur pairs were ready on a rack nearby. Brent complained bitterly that father had barged in yesterday and demanded crocodile skin armor. 2. With father's large build, it used up most of the remaining leather. Brent lost his second suit of armor and couldn't even get a pair of shoes out of the deal. Brent accused him of telling father about the crocodile skin. Chris dodged the question and suggested they go check on his dragon scale armor. They walked to Daniel's private forge. Inside, he was finishing the final touches. The armor had taken shape, dark gray, with an ancient, elegant look. With the last hammer strike, a red glow washed over it. A dragon soul phantom rose from the armor with a deep roar, and the entire suit transformed to fiery red, with scale-like patterns on the surface, radiating heat. Chris felt the armor calling his name. When Chris touched it, it broke apart into countless tiny red pieces that flew onto his body and reassembled themselves into a perfect fit. Brent shouted that it looked incredible. His crocodile armor suddenly seemed plain by comparison. The armor was incredibly light. Chris could not even feel its weight. The dragon's skin had great flexibility too. When Chris shifted into dragon human form, the armor grew with him. No more shredding his clothes every time Chris transformed. Then Chris tested its defense by slashing it with Dragon's Howl. The sword only left a white scratch mark, which vanished within seconds as if it had never existed. Chris tried again, even adding battle aura. Same result. Any damage healed itself almost immediately. Daniel slapped his forehead in excitement and declared the armor had a special effect: self-repair. Everyone in the room gasped. Self-healing armor was unheard of on the entire continent. In battle, your opponent's armor gets damaged while yours stays pristine. That's an insane advantage. Brent's eyes burned with envy. Daniel asked him to name it. Chris called it Unbreakable. The armor spirit acknowledged the name with a subtle vibration. Thankfully, it was much calmer than Dragon's Howl's dramatic entrance. When Chris were Unbreakable and held Dragon's Howl together, Chris could feel energy circulating between them and flowing into his body, subtly improving his constitution. Chris thanked Daniel and left. He hinted that if Chris had more dragon materials, Chris should bring them for forging. Brent nearly tripped hearing that. Walking through M-City, the stench hit him. No public toilets meant people relieved themselves in every hidden corner. Even the capital had this problem. Outside the inner city, Chris made a silent promise that if Chris ever built his own city, it would be clean and civilized. Then the blonde twins appeared again. Doyle complimented his new armor. Chris said one word, goodbye, and walked away. These two had been following him around like glue for days. After Chris left, Manda asked Doyle what he'd noticed about his armor. He told her it was made from dragon skin and dragon scales. Manda had no idea what she was in for. She had already lost their bet, and once her blue-scaled horse healed, Doyle would be riding it for a full month. Over the next few days, Chris supervised the orchard construction. Chris spent over 50 silver coins sending knights to buy large quantities of sugar and empty wine, jars for making and storing fruit jam. With 140 workers, the processing sheds were built quickly. The fruit trees had all matured thanks to Linda's magic. Red apples and golden pears hung heavy on the branches. Purple grapes covered the trellises, and sweet-smelling oranges filled the air further out. Reputation gains had slowed. Only 50 points over for days. But once the jam was ready, that would change. Chris started with the test batch. Chris had the workers pick 100 apples, peel and core them, and dice them into small pieces. Chris put the chunks in a big pot with 5 pounds of sugar and a little water, then cooked them over a fire. Chris skimmed the foam, washed the apples carefully, and added another 5 pounds of sugar when they turned nearly transparent. Then Chris used a small wind spell to stir the mixture into a smooth paste. The sweet and sour aroma filled the entire shed. Linda was practically drooling beside him. Chris ladled the hot jam into 10 jars and let them cool. Linda couldn't wait. She blew on a spoonful and ate it. Her eyes lit up, and she said it was amazing. She ate an entire jar on her own and still wanted more. Jonathan and the knights tried it too, and their eyes went wide. Everyone gave him 2 reputation points. The jam was a success. Chris wrote down the recipe and process. It was simple enough that ordinary people could learn it in half a day. Just proper sugar ratios and heat control. Chris had Randall select a dozen smart workers, and Chris demonstrated the method repeatedly until they mastered it. For the stirring step, Chris replaced the magic with a wooden stick so anyone could do it. These workers would become the core team, training others to form multiple production lines. This would be Hopetown's signature industry. It would help his people earn a living and generate steady reputation for him. Later that day, Brent showed up at the castle looking for him. Mrs. Ellen directed him to the orchard. On his walk through 𝗥𝗘𝗕𝗢𝗥, he was struck by how different things looked. Children ran around laughing and playing, their cheeks rosy and healthy. They weren't afraid of a noble stranger. A huge change from 6 months ago, when the kids would hide behind their parents at the sight of any outsider. He stopped 2 elderly men coming back from the fields and asked why everyone seemed so happy. They told him it was all thanks to him. Chris was paying every worker 50 copper coins a day for orchard work. In just a few days, a family could earn over a month's worth of food, and Chris had promised there would be work every day going forward. Brent was genuinely puzzled. Other nobles never paid their workers, and even the generous ones barely offered 10 copper. He couldn't understand why Chris was spending so much on common people. By the time Brent reached the orchard, his confusion had turned into real curiosity. Rows of young fruit trees stretched across land that had been empty only days earlier. Workers followed Chris's instructions instead of fear, carrying water and baskets with real purpose. Brent realized 𝗥𝗘𝗕𝗢𝗥 was not just surviving anymore. It was being rebuilt around Chris's new rules. The barren wasteland had transformed into a thriving orchard full of fruit. He found him inside one of the sheds taste-testing grape jam. Chris had spent the whole day perfecting the sugar ratios for different fruit jams. When Chris offered him a spoonful of grape jam, his eyes went wide. He said it was incredible, sweet and sour and delicious. He asked how Chris had grown an entire orchard so fast on land that was empty months ago. Chris told him Chris had his methods, but kept Linda's identity secret. If father found out Chris had a plant mage who could accelerate growth, he'd definitely try to poach her. The man had already coveted Dragon's Howl. Chris handed over the crocodile magic core and collected his 15 gold coins. Business done. Brent immediately saw the commercial potential of fruit jam. He proposed a partnership. The Jordan family had trade routes across multiple cities with knights to guard shipments and connections to handle tolls through other nobles' territories. He wanted a 70-30 split in the family's favor. Chris countered with 50-50. He said 40-60 was his final offer. Chris agreed instantly, but with 2 conditions. First, the M-City market stayed exclusively his. Second, every jar sold in other cities had to carry his name as a label. He thought the second condition was odd, but agreed since it didn't cost him anything. This was exactly what Chris wanted. Having the Jordan family distribute his jam across multiple cities meant reputation points flowing in from places Chris had never even visited. Then a worker brought in the improved pear jam. Chris offered it to Brent. He insisted he never ate pears and would rather starve or jump in the lake than touch pear jam. 10 seconds later, he was eating it and mumbling that it was delicious. One more reputation point for his dear brother. Brent tried all 4 flavors of jam: apple, pear, grape, and orange, and couldn't stop eating. Even though he was already full, he was completely sold on their business partnership. Chris took him on a tour of the orchard. He was amazed at how healthy every tree looked. Lush leaves, full fruit, almost no bad apples or bird damage. He couldn't figure out how Chris had managed it. Chris kept Linda's secret. Then at the irrigation channel, Brent froze. In the water below, a tiny crocodile about 20 centimeters long was sitting on the bottom. A perfect miniature iron-armored crocodile. Then another one swam over from the lake. Chris explained that there had been 2 crocodiles in the lake, a mated pair. The female had laid over a dozen eggs that had just hatched. His plan was to raise them, let them breed, and eventually turn this lake into a crocodile farm, producing a steady supply of armored hides and magic cores. Brent was stunned by the ambition. Nobody dared farm second-rank magical beasts. But the economics were incredible. A single hide was worth 12 gold coins, a magic core 15, and the costs were practically zero, since the crocodiles could feed themselves in the huge lake. When he tried to propose a business deal, Chris shut him down immediately. The crocodiles were strategic. Chris planned to use their hides to armor an elite knight squad and their magic cores for training, all to prepare for the war against the Edmund Society in a year. Chris was even feeding the babies his own blood to speed up their growth. Brent was disappointed, but asked him to give him first priority if Chris ever decided to sell any. Chris told him they'd see. Chris cut his palm and dripped blood into the channel. The baby crocodiles eagerly gobbled it up, and they seemed to grow slightly before their eyes. The mother crocodile surfaced in the lake nearby, watching from a distance. Brent finally understood why Chris dug the channels. keeping the workers safe from the mother while still accessing the water. After the tour, Brent left impressed. He said he'd discuss the jam sales plan with him next time Chris came to 𝗡𝗡𝗡. 𝗡𝗡𝗕 was transforming from a barren, hopeless territory into something with real potential, and even Brent could see it. After he left, Chris went back to perfecting the jam recipes. Through multiple rounds of testing and having workers taste test, Chris settled on 2 versions of each flavor, 𝗥𝗘𝗕𝗢𝗥𝗡 and a lightly sweetened variety. For the fruits, there were 8 flavors total. His plan was to sell only 1 flavor per day, rotating through them. That way, people in 𝗡𝗡𝗡 would take much longer to get tired of any single taste. And Chris could keep earning reputation for longer. Sales had dropped because a competitor, Baron Leverett, was running a promotion on his pineapple buns. Buy one, get a free strawberry bun, plus 2 copper coins cash back. Chris's servant, George, came back with this report. Chris wasn't worried about the competition itself. What bothered him was the timing. Chris was so close to reaching 2,000 reputation and breaking through to 2nd rank Magic Warrior. Anyone disrupting his business right now was going to regret it. Chris sat down and came up with something this world had never seen: lottery. Chris cut paper into over 1,000 tickets, each with matching numbered pairs. Chris sprinkled magic-infused water on them as a counterfeit prevention measure. Then Chris set up a sign outside listing the prizes. 33rd place winners get a bowl of snow cake. 10 second place winners get a jar of apple jam. And 1 grand prize winner gets half a pound of dragon meat. Someone asked if the dragon meat was real. Chris smiled and confirmed it was genuine. The crowd exploded. Dragon meat was something ordinary people never even dreamed of seeing. In the capital, it sold for 1 gold coin per pound. Half a pound was worth 50 silver. And more importantly, it could strengthen your body and boost a knight's battle aura. People swarmed the stall. Chris tore each ticket in half. 1 piece went into the box, the other to the buyer. News spread across 𝗡𝗡𝗡 at lightning speed. Everyone believed they'd be the lucky winner. The only requirement was buying a jam sandwich. Then you got a free ticket. Crowds poured in from every direction. Meanwhile, Baron Leverett watched his shop empty out in under 30 seconds as all his customers rushed to his stall. He was furious. His brother came running in with the ticket and explained the lottery system. Leverett immediately hatched a scheme. Forge identical tickets with copied handwriting. Make multiple sets, and no matter what number won the grand prize, they'd have matching tickets to claim the dragon meat. Either Chris would run out of dragon meat and lose face, or Chris would have to hand over several pounds at a loss. He thought he was clever, but he didn't know about his anti-counterfeit magic water. Over in the crowd, Doyle and Manda spotted the commotion. Doyle muttered that Chris caused another citywide sensation. Manda wondered where Chris got dragon meat. Doyle pointed out that if Chris had a dragon fang sword and dragon scale armor, half a pound of meat was nothing. They tried to get tickets, but it was too late. With this many people flooding in, the sandwiches would sell out instantly. By the time they arrived at his shop, the street was packed with over 10,000 people, with more still coming.